Hey there, night owls. Tonight we're talking about three cities that basically invented the world you're living in right now, and I'm not being dramatic. Amsterdam. Before these places figured out what they were doing, capitalism as we know it didn't exist. Stock markets? Not a thing. Massive urban planning? Nope. The whole idea that you could turn empty land into cold hard cash? That started in these three spots, and the ripple effects are still washing over us centuries later. So here's the deal. Before we jump into how a handful of Dutch merchants on a town square accidentally invented modern finance, or how London burned down and became better for it, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. What city are you in right now? Alright, dim those lights, get comfortable, maybe grab something to drink, because we're about to trace the blueprint of the modern city, from canal-laced Amsterdam to the grid streets of Manhattan. And ready? Let's go. So let's start with Amsterdam, because nothing says we're about to change the entire global economy, quite like 10 merchants meeting in a town square to complain about Portuguese spice prices. The year is 1594, and these 10 guys are standing on Dam Square, which by the way is literally named after the dam that created the city, because Dutch naming conventions have always been refreshingly straightforward, and they're collectively having what we might call an entrepreneurial crisis. The Portuguese had a complete stranglehold on the spice trade, which meant if you wanted pepper, cinnamon, cloves or nutmeg, you were paying whatever Lisbon decided to charge that week. And trust me, Lisbon was charging a lot. Now here's where it gets interesting. These weren't just random merchants having a casual grumble about import costs over beer. These were some of the wealthiest, most connected traders in Amsterdam, and they were genuinely frustrated. For decades, the Dutch had been middlemen in the spice trade, buying from Portuguese traders who'd sailed to the East Indies, then reselling throughout Northern Europe. It was a decent business model, except for one tiny problem. They had zero control over supply, zero control over prices, and zero leverage in negotiations. The Portuguese would show up with a shipload of spices, name their price, and the Dutch merchants could either pay up or watch their competitors snap up the inventory. Not exactly a sustainable business strategy for people who are used to being in control. So these 10 merchants, and we're talking about men with names like Reinier Pauw, Pieter Hasselaer, and Dirk van Os, though honestly their names matter less than what they were about to accomplish, made a decision that would quite literally reshape global commerce. They decided to cut out the middleman entirely. Forget buying from Portuguese traders. Forget negotiating with Lisbon. They would organise their own expedition directly to the East Indies, establish their own trade routes, and bring spices back to Amsterdam themselves. Which sounds simple enough until you remember that in 1594, the route to the East Indies was one of the most dangerous, unpredictable, and technically challenging voyages a European ship could attempt. The Portuguese had been perfecting this journey for nearly a century, losing countless ships and sailors in the process, and now a group of Dutch merchants who'd never personally sailed past Gibraltar were proposing to just figure it out themselves. The audacity of this plan cannot be overstated. The route around Africa to the East Indies was roughly 15,000 miles one way, through waters that were poorly mapped, frequently stormy, and inhabited by people who weren't necessarily thrilled about European ships showing up to monopolise their local trade. The journey typically took anywhere from 18 months to 2 years round trip, assuming your ship didn't sink, your crew didn't mutiny, and you didn't accidentally sail into a reef because your charts were based on Portuguese documents that had been deliberately falsified to mislead competitors. The Portuguese and Spanish had spent the better part of a century treating navigation data like classified military secrets, which meant the Dutch were essentially proposing to reverse engineer one of the most complex commercial operations in the world with incomplete information and sheer determination. But here's the thing about Dutch merchants in the 1590s. They were, to put it mildly, motivated. Amsterdam was already a major trading hub, handling grain from the Baltic, timber from Scandinavia, and fish from the North Sea. The city had grown spectacularly wealthy by being really good at moving goods from one place to another and taking a cut in the process. But spices represented something different. Spices were the luxury good of the era, the one commodity that could generate profit margins that made even the most successful grain merchant weak in the knees. A shipload of pepper purchased in Java could sell in Amsterdam for 10 times what you paid for it, assuming you could get it there intact. Cloves and nutmeg offered even better returns. So these 10 merchants pooled their resources and convinced several dozen other investors to chip in, creating what they called a Company for Distant Lands. Not exactly the catchiest name in business history, but it got the point across. They raised enough capital to outfit 4 ships, hire experienced captains who'd sailed in Portuguese or Spanish service, and stock the expedition with everything they'd need for a 2-year voyage. Food, water, trade goods, weapons, spare sails, navigation equipment, and probably a fair amount of optimism. The expedition would be led by a man named Cornelis de Houtman, who'd spent time in Lisbon and claimed to have inside knowledge of the spice routes. Whether he actually had reliable information or was just very good at selling himself is debatable, but the merchants were willing to take the chance. Now, de Houtman's expedition, which departed in April 1595, was not what you'd call a roaring success. In fact, if you were judging purely by immediate results, you'd probably call it a bit of a disaster. The voyage took 2 years and 4 months, longer than expected, and of the 249 men who departed, only 87 made it back alive. Disease, scurvy, conflicts with local rulers in Java, and general navigational confusion took a heavy toll. De Houtman himself turned out to be a difficult leader, who managed to alienate both his crew and the local traders he was supposed to be negotiating with, which is quite an achievement when you consider his entire job was to be diplomatic and keep people alive. At one point, his aggressive tactics in the port of Bantam nearly got the entire expedition killed when local authorities decided these particular Dutch traders were more trouble than they were worth. But, and this is crucial, the expedition came back. They came back with spices. Not a huge amount, and certainly not enough to justify the investment based purely on that voyage's returns, but they proved it could be done. The Dutch could sail to the East Indies, establish trade relationships, and return with the goods. More importantly, they brought back detailed information about the route, the ports, the local political situations, and the going prices for spices in Southeast Asian markets. That information was worth more than the cargo itself, because it meant the next expedition could be smarter, faster, and more profitable. And there would definitely be a next expedition, because once you've proven that Portuguese monopoly wasn't actually unbreakable, every merchant in Amsterdam with spare capital wanted in on the action. This is where things get really interesting from an economic standpoint. Between 1595 and 1601, no fewer than 14 separate expeditions departed from Dutch ports bound for the East Indies. Not 14 ships, 14 separate expeditions, many with multiple vessels. Each was organised by a different group of merchants, each competing for the same trade routes and the same supplies of spices. Amsterdam had 5 competing companies, Rotterdam had 2, and smaller cities were getting in on the action as well. This was capitalism in its rawest, most chaotic form, pure competition with minimal regulation and maximum risk. Some expeditions made fortunes, others lost everything. The merchants who'd organised de Houtman's voyage learned from their mistakes and sent out better planned, better led expeditions. Other merchant groups learned from watching those expeditions and tried to undercut them. The problem, of course, was that all this competition was creating some serious inefficiencies. When you've got multiple Dutch companies bidding against each other for spices in Java, you're driving up prices in Asia. When those basic economics really, but apparently not obvious enough to these merchants until they'd spent several years cutting into each other's profit margins. Meanwhile, the Portuguese and Spanish were watching this Dutch free-for-all with a mixture of annoyance and amusement, occasionally trying to interfere with expeditions, but mostly just raising their own prices to match the inflated Asian market. There was also the not insignificant issue of military vulnerability. Individual trading expeditions, even well-armed ones, were sitting ducks for Spanish or Portuguese warships. The Dutch Republic was technically at war with Spain during this period, the 80 Years' War, which is exactly what it sounds like, a really, really long conflict, so any Dutch trading vessel was potentially a target for Spanish attack. A single ship or even a small fleet couldn't really defend itself against a determined military assault, which meant every expedition was gambling not just on the usual maritime risks, but also on whether they'd encounter hostile forces along the way. Some expeditions hired armed escorts. Others tried to sail in convoy. But the fundamental problem remained. Fragmentation meant weakness, both economically and militarily. So by 1602, after 7 years of chaotic competition, the merchants of Amsterdam and the other Dutch trading cities reached a conclusion that must have pained every independent-minded businessman involved. They needed to cooperate. Not just cooperate in the casual sense of let's not undercut each other too badly, but actually merge their competing companies into a single, unified organisation. This was a radical idea at the time. Merchants guarded their trade secrets jealously. The notion of sharing detailed information about routes, contacts, and pricing with your direct competitors went against every instinct these men had developed over their careers. But the alternative, continuing to compete themselves into unprofitability while foreign powers picked them off one by one, was even worse. The result was the Vereinigte Ostindische Kompanie, which translates to the United East India Company and is mercifully abbreviated as the VOC. The VOC was chartered in March 1602, combining all the competing Dutch trading companies into a single entity with a monopoly on Dutch trade east of the Cape of Good Hope. And when I say monopoly, I mean the Dutch government literally granted them exclusive rights to all trade in that entire region, backed by military force if necessary. If you were a Dutch merchant and wanted to trade with Asia, you either worked with the VOC or you didn't trade with Asia. Simple as that. Now the VOC wasn't organised like a traditional merchant venture, where a small group of investors would pool money for a single expedition, then divide the profits once the ships returned. That model worked fine for individual voyages, but it was inefficient for a long-term commercial operation. Instead, the VOC was set up as a permanent joint stock company. Investors would buy shares in the company itself, not in individual voyages. Those shares could be bought and sold independently of the company's operations. Shareholders would receive dividends based on the company's overall profitability, but their shares retained value regardless of whether any particular expedition succeeded or failed. This might not sound revolutionary to us because we're used to the idea of corporations and stock markets, but in 1602, this was genuinely innovative. The VOC was creating a separation between ownership and operation that hadn't really existed before in this form. You could own a piece of the company without having any role in actually running it. You could sell your ownership stake to someone else without needing permission from the company or the other shareholders. The value of your shares would fluctuate based on the company's performance and the market's perception of its future prospects, not just on whether the ship you'd invested in came back intact. This was, in essence, the beginning of the modern stock market, though nobody involved quite realised they were inventing it at the time. The VOC raised an enormous amount of capital for this venture, 6.5 million guilders, which in today's money would be somewhere in the neighbourhood of $100 million. Though honestly, comparing early modern currencies to contemporary values is always a bit of a dubious exercise. The point is, this was a massive amount of money, far more than any individual merchant group could have raised on their own. And because it was structured as a permanent company rather than a single voyage venture, the VOC could make long-term investments that wouldn't pay off for years. They could establish permanent trading posts in Asia. They could build their own ships in Asian ports instead of sailing everything from Amsterdam. They could hire standing military forces to protect their operations. All of this, the organisational structure was equally innovative. The VOC was governed by the Heren 17th, the 17 gentlemen, a board of directors drawn from the various chambers in different Dutch cities. Amsterdam got 8 seats because they'd contributed the most capital. Other cities got smaller representations. These 17 men would make all the major decisions about the company's operations, where to send expeditions, which ports to establish, who to trade with, what prices to pay, and crucially, what dividends to distribute to shareholders. They were, and Amsterdam, as the largest contributor of capital and the location of the company's primary office, became the de facto centre of this entire operation. The city went from being one player among many in Dutch trade to being the financial heart of what would become the most powerful commercial enterprise in the world. Ships that had previously sailed from Rotterdam, Hoorn or Enkhuizen now consolidated in Amsterdam's harbour. Investors from across the Dutch Republic came to Amsterdam to buy and sell VOC shares. Information about spice prices, shipping routes and trading conditions flowed through Amsterdam's merchant networks. The city was becoming something fundamentally different from what it had been just a decade earlier. Not just a trading port, but a financial capital. But we're getting ahead of ourselves slightly, because there's another piece of this puzzle that made the Dutch absolutely dominant in Asian trade, and it had nothing to do with finance or business organisation. It had to do with ships. Specifically, it had to do with the fact that the Dutch had figured out how to build ships better, faster and cheaper than anyone else in Europe, and this technological advantage was about to reshape global commerce in ways that even the creation of the VOC couldn't match. The financial innovation mattered, absolutely, but it would have been much less effective if the Dutch hadn't simultaneously revolutionized the physical technology of long-distance trade. See, here, profits depended on how much cargo you could carry, how quickly you could complete the round trip, and how many voyages you could make before your ship fell apart. The Portuguese and Spanish used large, heavily armed carracks for their Asian trade. Impressive vessels, but slow, expensive to build, and requiring large crews. The English were experimenting with various designs but hadn't really settled on an optimal model. And then there were the Dutch, who'd spent the previous century becoming Europe's most efficient shipbuilders through the simple expedient of building thousands and thousands of cargo vessels for the Baltic grain trade. The Dutch specialised in a ship called a fluit, which English speakers would later call a fluit, or sometimes just a flyboat, though that makes it sound much more exciting than it actually was. The fluit was, by design, the most boring, practical, cost-effective cargo ship anyone had yet invented. It was relatively narrow, which reduced the amount of expensive timber needed for construction. It had a flat bottom, which made it stable and easy to load. It could carry an enormous amount of cargo relative to its crew size. A typical fluit needed only about a third as many sailors as a comparable Portuguese carrack carrying the same cargo. This meant, now you might be wondering how the Dutch managed to make a ship that needed fewer crew members. After all, sailing a ship is labour-intensive work. Someone needs to adjust the sails, man the helm, maintain the rigging, and handle all the other tasks that keep a vessel moving. The answer lies in a series of clever engineering innovations, the most important of which was developed by a man named Cornelis Zoon around 1594, the same year, coincidentally, that those 10 merchants were meeting in Dam Square to plan their spice expedition. Cornelis Zoon invented a wind-powered sawmill that used a crankshaft mechanism to convert the rotating motion of a windmill into the back-and-forth motion needed to operate a saw. This might seem like a tangent, but bear with me, because this is actually crucial to understanding Amsterdam's dominance. Before Cornelis Zoon's invention, sawing timber was done by hand, with 2 men operating a long saw in a pit, one standing above the log, one standing below in the pit, both pulling the saw back and forth for hours on end. It was exhausting, time-consuming, and expensive. Cornelis Zoon's wind-powered sawmill could do the work of dozens of men, and do it more precisely and consistently. This meant the Dutch could produce ship timber much faster and cheaper than anyone else. They could build more ships, and they could build them with standardized components that made construction faster and repairs easier. The ripple effects of this single invention were extraordinary. Because they operated more ships, they could charge lower freight rates than their competitors. Because they charged lower rates, they won more contracts. Because they won more contracts, they built even more ships. By the 1590s, the Dutch controlled somewhere around 3/4 of all the grain shipped from the Baltic, and they were making inroads into every other cargo market they could reach. And all of this technological and commercial expertise was now being channeled into the VOC's Asian operations. The Dutch Vok fleet could make the round trip to Asia in 18 months, where a Portuguese fleet might take 2 years. They could carry more cargo with smaller crews. They could undercut Portuguese prices while still making healthy profits. The combination of the joint stock company structure with Dutch shipbuilding technology created a commercial juggernaut that would dominate Asian trade for the next 2 centuries. Let's zoom back in on Amsterdam specifically, because while all of this Dutch commercial expansion was happening, the city itself was being physically transformed to accommodate its new role as a global trading centre. In 1594, when those 10 merchants met in Dam Square, Amsterdam was already a substantial city by contemporary standards, maybe 30,000 people, busy harbour, prosperous, but not remarkable. By 1602, when the Vok was chartered, the population had grown to perhaps 50,000 and was still increasing rapidly. Warehouse ships crowded the harbour to the point where finding dock space was becoming a logistical challenge. The city faced a very practical problem. It was running out of room. Amsterdam's original medieval core was built on relatively small parcels of reclaimed land, protected by dikes and crossed by a few major canals. It worked fine for a modest trading town, but it couldn't accommodate the kind of explosive growth the city was experiencing. Housing prices were skyrocketing as merchants, sailors, craftsmen, and everyone else involved in the booming trade economy flooded into the city. The government was collecting taxes on all this commercial activity, and suddenly had both the money and the incentive to expand the city's physical footprint substantially. So this was a comprehensive, systematic plan to expand the entire city according to a rational design, with new canals arranged in concentric semicircles around the medieval core, with streets running perpendicular to the canals, with standardized plot sizes and building regulations. Nothing quite like this had been attempted before in European urban planning. Most cities just grew organically, with new buildings added wherever there was space, streets following old paths or property lines, and infrastructure retrofitted as needed. Amsterdam was proposing to engineer an entire new urban landscape from scratch. The engineering required was substantial. Amsterdam is built on reclaimed marshland, which means the water table is extremely high, and the soil is extremely soft. You can't just dig a canal and expect it to hold. You need to shore up the sides with wooden pilings, and you need to ensure proper drainage so the canal doesn't just become a stagnant swamp. Every building needs to be supported on wooden foundation piles driven deep into the clay beneath the peat. The city had been doing this for centuries on a small scale, but now they were proposing to do it systematically for an area several times larger than the existing city. The amount of timber required, for pilings, for canal reinforcements, for the buildings themselves, was staggering, which was fortunate because the Dutch controlled the Baltic timber trade and could ship in as much wood as they needed. The design that emerged was elegant in its simplicity. 3 major canals, the Herengracht, Keizersgracht and Prinsengracht, would curve around the old city centre in parallel arcs. Cross streets would connect them at regular intervals. The land between the canals would be divided into standardised plots, with the wealthy merchant class building tall, narrow townhouses along the main canals and more modest housing tucked into the streets behind. The city specified minimum building standards to prevent the kind of cramped, fire-prone wooden construction that plagued most European cities. Buildings had to be brick or stone. They had to meet certain height and width requirements. They couldn't extend too far over the canal to prevent the streets from becoming dark tunnels. The city wasn't building this expansion for prestige or glory, though those certainly played a role in the details. They were building it because they needed more space to house the merchants, warehouses and workshops driving the city's economy. The whole project was essentially real estate development on a massive scale, with the city acting as both planner and primary developer. They would dig the canals and lay out the streets, then sell the building plots to private buyers who would construct their own houses according to the regulations. The revenue, and critically, the timing of this expansion aligned almost perfectly with the creation of the VOC and the explosive growth in Amsterdam's role in global trade. Just as the city was consolidating its position as the financial centre of Dutch commerce, it was also physically expanding to accommodate that new role. The merchants making fortunes from spice trade were building grand houses along the new canals. The skilled craftsmen needed to support this trade. Shipwrights, rope makers, sail makers, warehouse workers, clerks, accountants were filling in the neighbourhoods behind the canals. The city was literally constructing the physical infrastructure of commercial capitalism. At the same time, it was inventing the financial instruments to support it. There's a certain irony in the fact that Amsterdam's 2 greatest innovations, the joint stock company and systematic urban planning, both emerged from the same basic impulse: the recognition that ad hoc, individualistic approaches couldn't scale to meet the demands of early modern commerce. Just as competing merchant companies needed to merge into the VOC to be effective, Amsterdam's organic medieval growth pattern needed to give way to rational planning to accommodate the city's expansion. In both cases, Dutch pragmatism won out over tradition or individual preference. If cooperation and planning created more wealth than competition and chaos, then cooperation and planning it would be. By 1602, then, Amsterdam had positioned itself as something unprecedented in European commerce, a city that was simultaneously a financial capital, a trading hub, a manufacturing centre, and an experiment in large-scale urban planning. The VOC gave it control over the most profitable trade routes in the world. Dutch shipbuilding technology gave it a competitive advantage in freight costs. The Canal Belt expansion gave it the physical space to grow, and underlying all of it was a merchant culture that prioritised practical results over ideology, that valued efficiency over tradition, and that was willing to innovate ruthlessly in pursuit of profit. None of this happened in isolation, of course. The Dutch Republic's political structure, loose, decentralised, dominated by merchant interests rather than hereditary nobility, made this kind of commercial innovation much easier than it would have been in more rigid political systems. The religious tolerance that emerged from the Dutch Revolt meant that skilled workers and merchants from across Europe felt welcome in Amsterdam, bringing their expertise and capital with them. Amsterdam's rise wasn't inevitable. It required particular circumstances, particular people, and more than a little luck. But once the pieces fell into place, the results were spectacular. By the 1620s, Amsterdam was the wealthiest city in Europe, possibly the wealthiest city in the world. VOC dividends were making shareholders rich. The Canal Belt was filling up with grand merchant houses. The harbour was packed with ships from every corner of the globe. The city had become what we might call the first truly global city, a place where you could find commodities from Indonesia, information from Japan, fashions from France, and religious refugees from Spain, all coexisting in a fairly small geographic area. The model of commercial urban life that Amsterdam pioneered, dense, diverse, driven by trade, with wealth concentrated in merchant hands rather than aristocratic estates, would eventually spread across the Western world. And here's the thing that makes Amsterdam's story particularly fascinating for our purposes. Everything they invented by accident. Nobody sat down in 1594 and said, "Let's create the first modern corporation and revolutionize urban planning." They were just solving immediate practical problems. How do we compete with the Portuguese? Create a larger, more efficient company. How do we house all these new residents? Plan a systematic expansion. How do we reduce shipping costs? Invent better sawmills and build cheaper ships. Each innovation was a response to a specific challenge, not part of some grand vision of remaking global commerce. But cumulatively, these practical solutions created something entirely new. They created a template for how cities could organize themselves around trade and finance, rather than agriculture or military power. They created financial instruments that would eventually evolve into modern stock markets. They created urban planning principles that would be copied and adapted by cities around the world. Those 10 merchants meeting in Dam Square in 1594 probably thought they were just starting a trading company. They had no idea they were laying the groundwork for modern capitalism. And that ultimately is what makes Amsterdam the first of our 3 cities. Not because everything that comes after, in London and New York, builds on the foundations laid in Amsterdam between 1594 and 1602. The joint stock company, the stock exchange, the planned urban expansion, the concentration of financial services in a single urban centre, all of these started in Amsterdam. The Dutch, the English and Americans would copy it, adapt it, and eventually surpass it, but they were working from Amsterdam's original design. So when we talk about Amsterdam as one of the 3 cities that built the modern world, we're not being hyperbolic. Those merchants on Dam Square, that sawmill inventor in Zaandam, those city planners drawing up canal routes, they were quite literally inventing the economic and urban systems that still govern how we live today. They just, not exactly romantic, but then again, the actual business of building the modern world rarely is. Let's dig a little deeper into what daily life looked like in Amsterdam during this period, because the transformation happening at the economic and urban planning level was mirrored by equally dramatic changes in how ordinary people experienced the city. In 1594, Amsterdam was still recognisably medieval in character. Narrow streets, wooden houses pressed close together, a few churches dominating the skyline, and the constant smell of fish from the harbour, mixing with the less pleasant odours of a city without any real sewage system. By 1602, it was becoming something different. Still smelly, unfortunately, they hadn't solved that problem yet, but different. The merchant class was experiencing a level of prosperity that would have seemed fantastical just a generation earlier. The leading Vioch investors weren't just wealthy by Amsterdam standards, they were wealthy by any European standards. These were men who could afford to commission portraits from the best artists, furnish their new canal houses with imported luxuries, and make business decisions involving sums of money that would have represented entire national budgets for smaller countries. They ate off Chinese porcelain, wore silk from India, and seasoned their food with spices that had travelled 15,000 miles to reach their dining tables. The physical distance those spices travelled was matched by the social distance these merchants had travelled from their own modest origins. Many were just a generation or 2 removed from much more modest circumstances. But here's what's interesting. Despite this wealth, Amsterdam's merchant elite maintained a certain studied modesty in public behaviour, at least compared to the aristocracies of other European countries. There were no titles of nobility being thrown around. The Dutch Republic had specifically rejected hereditary aristocracy as part of their revolt against Spain. You couldn't tell who was wealthy by looking for coats of arms or fancy titles. You had to look at more subtle indicators: the quality of someone's clothing, the size of their house on the canal, which church pew they occupied on Sunday. This created a commercial culture that was simultaneously more egalitarian and more ruthlessly competitive than traditional aristocratic societies. Anyone with enough capital and business sense could potentially join the merchant elite. But once you were there, you were constantly competing with everyone else for commercial advantage. The VOC intensified this dynamic. Because shares could be freely bought and sold, and because the company's performance directly affected share value, Amsterdam's merchants became obsessed with information. What was the latest news from Java? How many ships had the company lost in the past year? What were spice prices doing in Lisbon? This information was quite literally money. If you knew that a VOC fleet had arrived safely in the East Indies before other shareholders did, you could buy more shares before the price went up. If you heard rumours of losses, you could sell before the market panicked. The result was an information economy that anticipated modern financial markets by several centuries. Coffee houses, though this was slightly before coffee became common, so let's call them taverns, became informal information exchanges where merchants would gather to hear the latest news and gossip. Ship arrivals were major events because the captains and crew brought fresh information from Asia. Letters from VOC representatives in Bantam or Batavia were circulated, copied and analysed in detail. There was no official financial news service, no CNBC equivalent providing market updates, so information spread through word of mouth, personal correspondence, and increasingly through printed pamphlets that reported on shipping news. Amsterdam was developing the information infrastructure of a financial capital alongside the physical infrastructure. The population was increasing by several thousand people per year, which put enormous pressure on food supplies, housing, public order, and every other aspect of urban life. Amsterdam was pulling in migrants from across the Dutch Republic and beyond. Ambitious young men looking for work in the shipping trades, skilled craftsmen attracted by high wages, refugees from religious persecution elsewhere in Europe, and more than a few people who just wanted to be part of something exciting and prosperous. This cosmopolitan mix was one of Amsterdam's great strengths, but it also created social tensions that the city had to actively manage. Religious tolerance, which Amsterdam is famous for, was actually less a matter of high-minded principle than practical necessity. The city had Calvinists, Catholics, Lutherans, Mennonites, and eventually Jews, all living in relatively close proximity. In most European cities, this kind of religious diversity would have led to violence. The early modern period was not exactly famous for religious tolerance. Amsterdam managed to avoid the worst sectarian conflicts through a combination of official Calvinist supremacy and unofficial tolerance for private worship. Catholics couldn't have public churches, but they could have private chapels in attics and back rooms. Jews couldn't hold public office, but they could trade freely. It wasn't this tolerance had direct economic benefits. Religious refugees brought skills and capital with them. Portuguese Jews brought connections to trading networks in the Mediterranean and the Ottoman Empire. The practical-minded Amsterdam merchants recognized that excluding people based on religion was just bad business. Better to let everyone trade freely and collect taxes on the resulting commerce. The city's famous pragmatism extended to religious policy. Believe whatever you want, but don't disturb the public order and make sure you pay your taxes. The shipbuilding industry, centered in Amsterdam but extending to nearby towns like Zaandam, was operating at a scale that would have seemed impossible just decades earlier. The Zaan region, just north of Amsterdam, was becoming the world's first industrial zone, with hundreds of windmills powering sawmills, oil presses, paint mills, and other industries supporting ship construction. The constant sound of sawing, hammering, and general construction noise was, by all accounts, considerable. These weren't quiet workshops. These were large-scale industrial operations working around the clock to meet the VOC's seemingly insatiable demand for new vessels. The VOC's shipyards at Amsterdam became one of the largest industrial complexes in Europe. They maintained vast warehouses for storing timber, rope, canvas, and ship supplies. They employed thousands of workers, shipwrights, carpenters, rope makers, sail makers, and labourers. The company operated its own bakeries to produce the hardtack that would feed crews on long voyages. They even maintained their own weapons foundries for producing the cannons needed to arm their ships. The VOC wasn't just a trading company, it was a vertically integrated manufacturing and logistics operation on a scale that wouldn't be seen again until the Industrial Revolution. The company's governance structure, meanwhile, was setting precedents that would influence corporate organisation for centuries. The Heeren 17th met regularly to review reports from Asia, authorised new expeditions, set dividend policy, and make strategic decisions about where to expand trade. They operated through various specialised committees handling finance, shipping, military affairs, and Asian operations. They maintained detailed records of every transaction, every voyage, every expense. This wasn't seat-of-the-pants merchant trading. This was systematic, bureaucratic management of a global commercial empire. The paperwork alone must have been staggering. Shareholders, meanwhile, were learning how to be shareholders. Remember, this was a new concept. Most investors had experience with traditional merchant ventures, where you put money into a specific voyage and got returns when the ships came back. The VOC was different. You owned shares in a permanent company, and those shares had value independent of any particular voyage. But what did that mean in practice? How should shares be valued? When should you buy or sell? These were an informal market for VOC shares emerged almost immediately. People wanted to buy shares after dividends were announced when prices were high. They wanted to sell shares when they needed cash for other investments. They wanted to speculate on the company's future performance. By 1608, a secondary market in VOC shares was active enough that people were already complaining about speculators manipulating prices. The Dutch version of short sellers are destroying our markets. The Amsterdam city government, recognizing both the importance of this trading and the potential for abuse, began establishing rules about where and how shares could be traded, what information had to be disclosed, and how disputes would be resolved. They were, in effect, creating the first securities regulations. Initially, share trading occurred wherever merchants happened to meet, in taverns, on the street, in each other's offices. But as the volume of trading increased, there was clear need for a centralized location where buyers and sellers could find each other efficiently. In 1608, Amsterdam approved construction of a purpose-built exchange building, the first structure specifically designed to house securities trading. The Amsterdam Stock Exchange wouldn't be completed until 1611, so it's slightly outside our 1594-1602 timeframe, but the groundwork was being laid during these years. The mere fact that the city recognized the need for such a building shows how central financial trading had become to Amsterdam's identity. The exchange building, when it was completed, was a simple but elegant structure, an open courtyard surrounded by covered arcades where merchants could gather to trade regardless of weather. No dramatic architecture, no soaring domes or elaborate decoration, just a practical space for practical men to conduct practical business, which, if you think about it, perfectly captured the Dutch approach to commercial capitalism. They weren't interested in grandeur for its own sake. They wanted infrastructure that worked efficiently and generated profits. If that infrastructure happened to be beautiful, fine, but beauty was always secondary to function. Life for ordinary Amsterdammers, the people who weren't wealthy merchants or VOC shareholders, was also changing during this period, though in less dramatic ways. The booming economy meant jobs were plentiful, at least for skilled workers. Wages for craftsmen and sailors were higher in Amsterdam than almost anywhere else in Europe, which is why so many people were flooding into the city. But the cost of living was also high. Housing was expensive. The gap between rich and poor was widening visibly, with merchant mansions going up on the canals while labourers crowded into subdivided houses in less fashionable neighbourhoods. The city had a fairly extensive system of poor relief, managed by churches and private charities, which kept absolute destitution somewhat in check. The Dutch Calvinist concept of civic responsibility meant that wealthy merchants were expected to contribute to charitable causes, not necessarily out of personal generosity, but because it was part of being a respectable member of the commercial elite. This wasn't Amsterdam's poor weren't starving in the streets, which distinguished it from many other European cities where poverty was much more visible and desperate. Women in Amsterdam had somewhat more economic freedom than in many other European societies, though somewhat more is doing a lot of work in that sentence. Merchant wives often helped manage their husbands' businesses, particularly handling correspondence and bookkeeping when the men were travelling. Widows could inherit and run businesses, and many did quite successfully. There were female market traders, shopkeepers, and artisans operating with relative autonomy. But this was still a profoundly patriarchal society, where women's opportunities were severely limited by law and custom. The VOC women couldn't vote, couldn't hold public office, and generally couldn't own property independently if they were married. The economic dynamism of Amsterdam created some space for women to operate, but within very strict boundaries. Children in merchant families were being prepared from an early age for commercial careers. Boys were taught arithmetic, bookkeeping, languages, and navigation, practical skills needed for trade. Some were sent to work in VOC offices or aboard ships as teenagers to learn the business from the ground up. Girls received education focused on household management, though daughters of wealthy merchants might also learn to read, write, and keep accounts. The children of labourers and craftsmen typically entered their parents' trades, with boys apprenticing in workshops and girls helping with household production. This was a society where social mobility was possible but still relatively rare. Most people ended up in roughly the same social position they were born into, regardless of Amsterdam's commercial dynamism. The VOC itself, meanwhile, was establishing the administrative systems that would govern its operations for the next 2 centuries. The company maintained a complex network of correspondence between its offices in Amsterdam and its agents across Asia. Letters took months to travel each direction, which meant that agents in Asian ports had considerable autonomy to make decisions without waiting for approval from headquarters. This created a particular kind of organizational culture where success depended on hiring competent people and trusting them to use their judgment. The VOC couldn't micromanage its operations from Amsterdam. The distances were too great and communications too slow. So they developed detailed written instructions, hired carefully, and then monitored results after the fact. This system of monitored autonomy became a model for how large-scale commercial organizations could operate across vast distances. The VOC's methods would be studied and copied by other trading companies, and eventually by industrial corporations in the 19th and 20th centuries. The basic principles, clear guidelines, careful hiring, regular reporting, accountability for results, sound obvious to us now because they've become standard practice in corporate management. But in 1602, the VOC was pioneering these approaches largely through trial and error, figuring out what worked and what didn't through expensive mistakes and occasional brilliant successes. The relationship between the VOC and the Dutch government was also setting important precedents. The company was private, owned by shareholders, governed by the Heren 17th, but it operated with government-granted monopoly powers and was expected to serve national interests alongside commercial ones. VOC ships were authorized to fight battles on behalf of the Dutch Republic. Company representatives negotiated treaties that affected Dutch foreign policy. The line between corporate and governmental power was blurry in ways that might make modern people uncomfortable, but that made perfect sense in the early modern context. The Dutch government didn't have the capacity to project power in Asia on its own, so it deputized the VOC to do so. This public-private partnership model, a commercial company with quasi-governmental powers, would be copied by the British East India Company, the French equivalents, and eventually by chartered companies operating in Africa and the Americas. The basic idea that governments could grant monopolies to private companies in exchange for those companies serving national interests became a standard tool of European colonial expansion. Whether this was a good thing is, of course, highly debatable. The VOC and companies like it did enormous harm in the regions they operated. But from a purely organizational standpoint, it was an innovation that proved remarkably durable. By 1602, then, Amsterdam had assembled all the pieces needed to become a global financial and commercial capital. The VOC provided the organizational structure and capital for large-scale trade. Dutch shipbuilding technology provided the competitive advantage in transportation costs. The Canal Belt expansion provided the physical space for growth. The emerging securities market provided a mechanism for mobilizing capital efficiently. The culture of religious tolerance provided access to skills and networks from across Europe. And underlying everything was a merchant culture that prized practical results, accepted risk as necessary for profit, and was willing to innovate ruthlessly in pursuit of competitive advantage. None of these elements, taken individually, was completely unprecedented. Joint stock companies had existed in rudimentary forms before. Urban planning wasn't invented in Amsterdam. Securities trading had antecedents in medieval Italian banking. But the combination of all these elements, implemented simultaneously in a single city, created something genuinely new, an urban economic model centered on commercial capitalism, financial markets, and global trade. Amsterdam was the prototype for a new kind of city, one whose wealth came not from controlling agricultural land or extracting tribute from subject populations, but from facilitating exchange, mobilizing capital, and managing information flows. The next century would see Amsterdam reach its peak as Europe's dominant commercial and financial center. VOC dividends would make shareholders spectacularly wealthy. The city would become famous for its paintings, its printing houses, its scientific instruments, and its tolerant intellectual culture. But, and this is important for our larger story, Amsterdam's dominance wouldn't last forever. The very model of commercial capitalism that the Dutch pioneered could be copied and adapted by other nations. The British in particular were paying close attention to what the Dutch were doing and thinking about how to compete. But that's getting ahead of ourselves. For now, in 1602, Amsterdam stood alone as the city that had figured out how to organize urban life around global commerce and financial capitalism. The merchants meeting in Dam Square in 1594 couldn't have predicted any of this. They were just trying to solve an immediate problem about spice prices. But their solution, pooling capital, organizing collectively, thinking systematically about long-term strategy, set in motion changes that would reshape not just Amsterdam, but the entire global economy. They were, in the most literal sense, building the modern world, one pragmatic business decision at a time. No grand vision, no master plan, just smart people solving problems and accidentally inventing capitalism along the way. And that perhaps is the most Dutch thing about the whole story. They didn't set out to revolutionize global commerce, or invent financial markets or create new forms of urban organization. They set out to make money, and they were practical enough to innovate whatever needed innovating to accomplish that goal. The revolution was a side effect. The modern world emerged from 10 merchants trying to cut costs on pepper imports, which is either inspiring or terrifying depending on your perspective, but it's definitely the way history actually works more often than we'd like to admit. Now we need to talk about sawmills because I know that sounds about as exciting as watching paint dry, but stick with me here. The story of how Amsterdam became the centre of global commerce isn't just about clever financial innovations and ambitious merchants. It's also about a guy named Cornelis Zoon, who, around 1594, invented a mechanism that would quite literally reshape the global balance of power. So let's dive into the surprisingly fascinating world of early modern industrial technology, because without understanding how the Dutch built ships better and cheaper than everyone else, you're missing half the story of why Amsterdam mattered. The standard method involved something called a pit saw, basically a long saw operated by two men, one standing on top of a log positioned over a pit, the other standing down in the pit below. They'd pull the saw back and forth, slowly working their way down the length of the log, producing planks one agonizing cut at a time. If you've ever done any manual sawing, you know how exhausting it is. Now imagine doing that for 10 hours a day, standing in a dusty pit, sawdust falling in your face, earning whatever minimal wage sawyers could command in the 1500s. Not exactly a career path that sparked joy, as the saying goes. A good pit saw team could maybe cut through a couple dozen logs in a day if they really pushed themselves and the wood cooperated, which meant that building a single large ship, which might require planks from hundreds of trees, took an enormous amount of time just for the sawing portion of construction. And time in the shipbuilding business was money. Every day a ship sat partially built in a shipyard was a day it wasn't out earning profits carrying cargo. Various people had experimented with mechanical saws over the centuries. Water-powered sawmills existed in limited numbers, using the rotation of a water wheel to drive a saw blade. But these had significant limitations. First, you needed a river or stream with sufficient flow to power the wheel, which restricted where you could build them. Second, the mechanism for converting the circular motion of a water wheel into the back-and-forth motion needed for sawing was complicated and inefficient. Most designs lost so much energy in the conversion that they weren't much faster than pit sawing, and the equipment broke down constantly. So while water-powered sawmills technically existed, they weren't reliable or efficient enough to transform the timber industry. Enter Cornelis Zoon, a Dutch millwright from a town called Uitgeest, just north of Amsterdam. Now, Cornelis Zoon wasn't trying to revolutionize global trade or enable Dutch imperial expansion. He was trying to solve a practical engineering problem, which is very on brand for Dutch innovation during this period. The Zaan region, where Cornelis Zoon lived and worked, was crisscrossed with canals and dotted with windmills. The Dutch had been using wind power for centuries to pump water out of polders, those reclaimed lands that would otherwise be underwater. They'd gotten very, very good at building windmills and using them for various purposes. Cornelis Zoon looked at all this wind power going to waste and thought, why can't we use this for sawing timber? The challenge was the same one that had plagued water-powered sawmills, converting rotational motion into reciprocating motion. A windmill's sails turn in circles. A saw needs to move back and forth. How do you bridge that gap efficiently? Cornelis Zoon's breakthrough was inventing a crankshaft mechanism specifically designed for this purpose. Now, cranks had existed before. Hand crank tools were common enough. But Cornelis Zoon's innovation was creating a robust, large-scale crankshaft that could handle the forces involved in industrial sawing while connecting to a windmill's drive shaft. The basic design used an offset wheel connected to a connecting rod, which pushed the saw frame back and forth as the wheel rotated. Cornelis Zoon built his first wind-powered sawmill in 1594, and the results were spectacular. A single windmill, on a decent day with reasonable wind, could saw as much timber as 30 or 40 pit sawyers working at full capacity. The quality was also better. The mechanical saw cut straighter and more consistently than hand sawing, which meant less waste and better fitting planks. Operating costs were minimal. You needed maybe 2 or 3 workers to feed logs into the mill and handle the cut planks, compared to dozens of sawyers doing the same work manually. The economic implications were staggering. Timber that had previously represented a major cost in ship construction suddenly became much cheaper to process. The Dutch shipbuilding industry basically lost its collective mind over this invention. Shipyards across the Zaan region started building wind-powered sawmills as fast as they could get the plans and equipment. Within a decade, there were dozens of these mills operating. Within 2 decades, the Zaan region had become the most productive shipbuilding centre in Europe, possibly in the world, powered by hundreds of windmills sawing timber, crushing oilseeds, making paint, and performing all the other industrial processes needed for ship construction. The landscape transformed into this surreal industrial park of windmills, warehouses and shipyards, all operating at a scale that wouldn't be seen again until the steam-powered Industrial Revolution 2 centuries later. Now you might be wondering why other countries didn't just copy this technology. After all, once Corneliszoon demonstrated that wind-powered sawing worked, the basic principles weren't exactly secret. The answer is partly geographical and partly cultural. The Netherlands had several advantages. First, it's flat and windy, ideal conditions for windmills. Second, the Dutch had centuries of experience building and maintaining windmills, so they had the technical expertise to implement Corneliszoon's design reliably. Third, and perhaps most importantly, the Dutch economic and legal system made it relatively easy to raise capital for industrial investment and to organise complex commercial operations. Building a wind-powered sawmill wasn't cheap, and you needed to integrate it into a larger shipbuilding operation to make it worthwhile. The Dutch had the capital, the expertise, and the organisational capacity to make this work at scale. But there's also the fact that Corneliszoon was granted a patent on his design by the Dutch government, which meant anyone using the technology in the Netherlands had to pay him licensing fees. This created a barrier to entry that kept the technology somewhat contained, at least initially. By the time the patent expired and other countries could freely use the design, the Dutch had such a head start in terms of installed capacity and accumulated expertise that competing with them was extremely difficult. They'd built an entire industrial ecosystem around wind-powered production, and that ecosystem reinforced itself. More sawmills meant cheaper timber, which meant more competitive shipbuilding, which justified building even more sawmills. The ships themselves that the Dutch were building with all this cheap timber were also revolutionary in their design. The Dutch specialised in what they called Vloot ships. We've mentioned these before, but let's dig deeper into what made them special. The Vloot was essentially the cargo container ship of the early modern period. Boring, practical, and ruthlessly optimised for economic efficiency, rather than speed or military capability. English sailors apparently couldn't pronounce Vloot properly and called them flyboats, which makes them sound much more exciting than they actually were. These were not exciting ships. They were rectangular boxes with sails attached, designed to carry the maximum amount of cargo with the minimum crew. The typical Vloot was maybe 80 to 100 feet long, with a relatively narrow beam, the width of the ship, compared to other cargo vessels of the period. This narrow beam was partly an economic optimization related to Danish toll policies, because the Danes controlled the straits between the North Sea and the Baltic and charged tolls based on a ship's beam measurement. By making ships narrower, the Dutch paid lower tolls while still maintaining decent cargo capacity through clever hull design. The Vloot also had a flat bottom rather than the rounded bottoms typical of most ships, which made it more stable and easier to load in shallow harbours. The aft section, the back of the ship, was dramatically narrower than the middle section, which created a distinctive pear shape when viewed from above and saved timber in construction. But the real innovation was in crew efficiency. A Portuguese carrack of comparable cargo capacity might need 60 or 70 sailors to operate safely. A Vloot could be sailed by 15 or 20. This reduction in crew size was achieved through several design features. The rigging, the ship's windlass, the mechanism for raising the anchor was designed with mechanical advantage that let a small crew do work that would normally require many more men. The steering mechanism was improved with better gearing. Every aspect of the ship was optimized to reduce labor requirements, which directly translated to lower operating costs. Fewer sailors meant less food to carry, less water, smaller crew quarters, and most importantly lower wage costs on every voyage. The Dutch also standardized ship construction to a degree that was unprecedented in European shipbuilding. Most shipyards built each vessel as a semi-custom project, with dimensions and details varying based on the owner's requirements and the shipwright's judgment. The Dutch started building Vloots to standardize specifications, which meant components could be mass-produced and construction processes could be refined for efficiency. Keels would be cut to standard lengths. Ribs would be shaped to standard curves. Deck beams would have standard dimensions. This standardization didn't just speed up construction, it also made repairs easier, since replacement parts could be made to known specifications rather than custom fitted to each individual ship. The economic impact of cheaper, more efficient ships rippled through the entire European economy. The Dutch could offer freight rates that undercut their competitors while still making healthy profits. This meant more and more cargo flowed through Dutch ships, which meant more revenue for Dutch merchants, which funded more shipbuilding, which further reduced costs in a beautiful self-reinforcing cycle of commercial dominance. By the early 1600s, the Dutch merchant fleet was larger than the English, French, Spanish and Portuguese fleets combined. Not just larger, vastly larger. Estimates vary, but some historians suggest the Dutch controlled as much as 3/4 of European shipping capacity by mid-century. Let's put this in perspective. England, which would eventually become the dominant naval and commercial power, had maybe 500 merchant ships of significant size in the early 1600s. The Dutch had something like 15,000. 15,000? The English were still debating optimal ship designs and arguing about whether government or private enterprise should drive shipbuilding. The Dutch had already figured it out, industrialized it, and moved on to dominating every cargo market they could reach. This wasn't a slight advantage. This was an overwhelming dominance that reshaped the entire pattern of European trade. The Zaan region, where much of this shipbuilding was concentrated, developed into something that looked surprisingly like later industrial zones. The area was essentially one long, continuous shipbuilding complex stretching along the river Zaan, with windmills for sawing timber interspersed with shipyards, warehouses, rope works, sailmakers, and all the other support industries needed for maritime commerce. Workers lived in dense housing near the shipyards, not exactly pleasant neighborhoods by modern standards, with noise, pollution, and the constant smell of pitch and paint. But wages were high enough that skilled shipbuilding workers could afford decent lives, at least by 17th century standards. The organization of labor in these shipyards was also innovative. Rather than the medieval guild system where craftsmen jealously guarded their skills and limited entry to their trades, the Dutch shipyards operated with more fluid labor arrangements. Yes, there were skilled shipwrights who designed vessels and oversaw construction, but much of the actual building was done by workers with more limited training, performing standardized tasks as part of a larger construction process. This was proto-industrial organization, breaking complex work into simpler tasks that could be performed by less skilled workers under skilled supervision. Not quite the assembly line of Henry Ford, but definitely a step in that direction. The VOC took full advantage of this shipbuilding capacity. These weren't, but they still incorporated Dutch design principles of efficiency and standardization. A Vok ship might be twice the size of a Floyd and carry 50 or 60 cannons, but it would still be designed to minimize crew size and maximize cargo space. These were floating warehouses first and warships second, optimized for the economic logic of long-distance trade. Building these larger ships required even more timber processing capacity, which drove further expansion of the wind-powered sawmill network. By the 1620s, the Zaan region had close to 1,000 windmills operating, many of them sawmills, creating what was probably the highest concentration of industrial power capacity anywhere in the world at that time. The sound and sight of this industrial zone must have been extraordinary. Hundreds of windmills turning, saws cutting, hammers pounding, all along a river lined with ships in various stages of construction. Visitors from other parts of Europe were reportedly astonished by the scale and intensity of industrial activity. This was something genuinely new in European experience, not craft production in small workshops, but industrial production at massive scale. The Dutch also developed sophisticated financial instruments specifically for the shipping industry. Ship owners could insure their vessels and cargoes against loss. Merchants could buy shares in individual ships, spreading risk across multiple vessels. There were standardized contracts for everything from ship construction to cargo handling to crew wages. This financial infrastructure made it easier to organize complex trading ventures and reduced the risk for individual investors. If you wanted to profit from maritime trade but didn't want to bet everything on a single voyage, you could buy shares in multiple ventures. If you wanted to build a ship but didn't have all the capital up front, you could find investors to partner with. The whole system was designed to mobilize capital efficiently and spread risk broadly. The shipyards themselves were masterclasses in logistics and organization. Building a large ship required coordinating dozens of different craft specialties: shipwrights, carpenters, blacksmiths, rope makers, sailmakers, painters, and various labourers. Materials had to be procured, stored, and deployed at the right times. Workers had to be hired, paid, and managed. Quality. The VOC's shipyards developed increasingly sophisticated management systems to handle all this complexity, with written contracts, detailed specifications, inspection protocols, and accounting systems that tracked every expense and every labour hour. This was modern project management being invented in real time, driven by the practical necessity of building dozens of large, complex vessels simultaneously. You can have the best financial systems in the world, the smartest merchants, the most ambitious trading plans, but if you can't actually move goods cheaply and reliably, none of that matters. The Dutch figured out how to move goods more cheaply than anyone else, and that competitive advantage translated directly into commercial dominance. Every time a Dutch ship could carry cargo more cheaply than an English or French competitor, that was money flowing into Dutch hands. Multiply that by thousands of ships making thousands of voyages, and you're talking about wealth accumulation on a national scale. The Dutch Republic was fighting Spain for its independence throughout this period, and while the Dutch couldn't match Spanish military power on land, they could absolutely dominate at sea. The famous Dutch admirals of this era, Piet Hein, Maarten Tromp, Michiel de Ruyter, had the advantage of commanding fleets that were qualitatively and quantitatively superior to their opponents. When you can build ships 3 times faster and twice as cheaply as your enemy, you can afford to lose battles and still win wars through attrition. The Spanish learned this lesson painfully over decades of naval conflict. There's also something to be said about how this industrial capacity shaped Dutch culture and identity. The Netherlands was never a traditional great power. It had a small population, limited natural resources, and no real military tradition compared to Spain or France. What it had was technological prowess, commercial acumen, and an ability to organize complex economic systems efficiently. The shipbuilding industry embodied all of these strengths. It was high-tech for the era, deeply integrated with commercial networks, and organized with systematic efficiency. The Dutch took pride in being really, really good at building ships, the same way Silicon Valley takes pride in being good at building software. It became part of national identity, the Dutch as maritime masters, practical engineers, commercial innovators. The environmental impact of all this shipbuilding was, it should be noted, considerable. Thousands of trees had to be cut down to feed the sawmills. The Zaane region became increasingly denuded of natural forest as timber demand grew. The Dutch started importing wood from Scandinavia and the Baltic in massive quantities, which created its own environmental pressures in those regions. The industrial processes, paint-making, pitch boiling, metalworking, created pollution that we'd now recognize as serious environmental hazards. The workers were exposed to toxic materials without any real understanding of occupational health. This was progress, certainly, but it came with costs that wouldn't be fully appreciated until centuries later. The dominance of Dutch shipbuilding also created economic vulnerabilities that wouldn't become apparent until later. The entire system depended on access to raw materials: timber, iron, hemp for rope, flax for canvas, most of which had to be imported. As long as the Dutch controlled the Baltic trade and maintained good relationships with Scandinavian suppliers, this worked fine. But it meant this difference would matter in later conflicts when access to materials became contested. But in the early 1600s, these future vulnerabilities weren't apparent. What was apparent was that the Dutch had cracked the code on industrial shipbuilding and were reaping enormous benefits from their technological leadership. The VOC's ships ranged across the globe, the Dutch merchant fleet dominated European trade, and Amsterdam's harbour was packed with vessels flying the red, white, blue of the United Provinces. The combination of Corneliszoon's sawmill invention, float ship design, standardized construction methods, and sophisticated financial systems created a competitive advantage that seemed almost insurmountable. Other countries tried to copy Dutch methods, of course. The English invited Dutch shipwrights to teach them float construction. The French studied Dutch designs and attempted to recreate their efficiency. But copying the surface features without understanding the underlying systems proved difficult. Dutch shipbuilding dominance wasn't just about knowing how to build a float. It was about having the industrial capacity to produce timber cheaply, the financial systems to fund construction efficiently, the labour force trained in standardized methods, and the commercial networks to keep ships employed profitably. All of these pieces had to work together, and replicating the entire system was far harder than copying individual elements. There's a lesson here about how technological and economic dominance actually works. It's rarely about a single invention or a single advantage. It's about systems, interconnected elements that reinforce each other and create competitive moats that are hard for rivals to cross. Cornelis, take away any one of those pieces and the dominance doesn't happen. The genius of Dutch success in this period was creating an ecosystem where all the pieces worked together and each advantage amplified the others. The VOC's operations in Asia also benefited directly from Dutch shipbuilding capacity. The company could afford to lose ships, and they did lose ships regularly, to storms, reefs, disease, warfare, and simple bad luck, because they could replace them relatively quickly and cheaply. The English East India Company, by contrast, had to be much more conservative in its operations because each lost ship was a major financial blow. The French companies that tried to compete in Asian trade were even more constrained by limited shipbuilding capacity. The Dutch could take bigger risks, send more expeditions, maintain larger fleets in Asian waters, and generally operate with an aggressiveness that their competitors couldn't match. This wasn't recklessness, it was strategic advantage created by superior industrial capacity. The shipyards also served as innovation centres where new designs and techniques were continuously developed. Because the Dutch were building so many ships, they could experiment with variations and modifications, learning what worked and what didn't through rapid iteration. A design improvement that saved even a small percentage of construction costs or improved cargo capacity slightly would be replicated across dozens of new ships within months. It was early modern R&D, funded by commercial competition and validated by market success. The workers in these shipyards were among the best-paid labourers in Europe, which attracted skilled craftsmen from across the continent. Germans, Scandinavians, and even English workers came to the Zaan region looking for employment in the booming shipbuilding industry. This international labour force brought additional expertise and ideas that further enhanced Dutch capabilities. The shipyards became melting pots of maritime knowledge, where techniques from different European shipbuilding traditions were combined and refined. Not exactly romantic multiculturalism, these were industrial workplaces, not cultural exchanges, but the practical benefits of bringing together expertise from different backgrounds were real. The standardization of ship components also created secondary markets in ship parts and supplies. If your ship needed a new mast or a replacement rudder, there were suppliers in Amsterdam who could provide standardized components rather than requiring custom construction. This made repairs faster and cheaper, which improved the economics of ship ownership. It also created entire industries supporting the maritime trade: rope makers, sail makers, anchor forgers, and countless others, all organized around standard specifications developed by Dutch shipbuilders. This industrial ecosystem made Amsterdam not just a place where ships were built, but a comprehensive maritime services centre. By the 1630s and 1640s, Amsterdam had achieved something unprecedented in European history. It had become genuinely indispensable to global commerce. If you wanted to ship goods anywhere in Europe, you probably needed Dutch ships or at least Dutch maritime expertise. If you wanted to trade with Asia, you were competing with the VOC or working with them. If you needed maritime insurance, financial services for shipping, or technical expertise in ship design, Amsterdam was the place to go. This wasn't just economic dominance, it was the creation of a hub-and-spoke system with Amsterdam at the centre, controlling the flows of goods, capital, and information that made global trade function. The technological foundations of this dominance, Corneliszoon's sawmill, the Vloeit design, standardized construction, were developed relatively quickly, mostly in the 1590s and early 1600s. But the advantages they created lasted for a century or more, because once the Dutch had built out their industrial capacity and established their commercial networks, the barriers to entry for competitors became enormous. You couldn't just decide to compete with Amsterdam. You had to build equivalent industrial capacity, develop equivalent financial systems, train equivalent labour forces, and establish equivalent commercial networks. This is the piece of Amsterdam's story that often gets overlooked in favour of the more glamorous financial innovations. The stock market and the VOC make for better stories than sawmills and ship design. But the truth is, the financial superstructure only worked because it rested on a foundation of real technological and industrial advantage. Amsterdam take away the shipbuilding advantage and the whole edifice becomes much shakier. So when we talk about how Amsterdam built the modern world, we need to acknowledge that it wasn't just built with financial instruments and clever business organisation. It was also built with wind-powered saws, standardised ship designs, and ruthlessly efficient production systems. The romance is all in the VOC and the stock exchange, but the reality is in the shipyards of Zaandam, where thousands of workers turned forests into fleets that dominated global trade for a century. Not as exciting as merchant adventurers exploring the Indies, perhaps, but probably more important in the long run. The Dutch won through superior logistics and industrial efficiency, which is less cinematically satisfying than dramatic naval battles, but tends to be how economic dominance actually works in practice. And that brings us back to the broader story of these three cities that shaped modern capitalism. Amsterdam, the sawmill wasn't just a sawmill. It was a proof of concept that smart investment in productive capacity could generate returns that far exceeded traditional commerce. This lesson wouldn't be lost on the English, who were watching Dutch success with a mixture of admiration and envy, carefully studying what made Amsterdam work and thinking about how to replicate it in London. But we're getting ahead of ourselves again. For now, just remember that beneath the glamorous world of spice trades and stock exchanges, there were hundreds of windmills turning, hundreds of saws cutting, and thousands of workers building the industrial foundation that made the whole thing possible. Let's dig deeper into the actual mechanics of how this industrial system functioned day to day, because the devil really is in the details here. A wind-powered sawmill wasn't just a windmill with a saw attached. It was a complex piece of machinery that required careful maintenance, skilled operation, and constant adjustment to work efficiently. The millwright who managed one of these facilities needed to understand wind patterns, mechanical stresses, timber properties, and a dozen other technical factors that could mean the difference between productive operation and expensive breakdowns. The basic operation went something like this. Timber would arrive at the mill, usually floated down canals from storage areas or directly from ports where Baltic ships had delivered it. Workers would haul logs onto a carriage system that held them steady while the saw cut through. The saw itself was a large blade, maybe 6 feet long, mounted in a frame that was driven back and forth by the crankshaft mechanism connected to the windmill's main shaft. As the blade reciprocated through the log, workers would slowly advance the log forward, creating a cut along its entire length. The thickness of the resulting plank depended on how far they advanced the log between passes of the saw. This sounds straightforward, but in practice it required constant attention and adjustment. Wind speed varied throughout the day, which meant the saw's speed varied as well. Too fast and the blade would bind in the wood or overheat from friction. Too slow and you were wasting time. The millwright had to continuously adjust the windmill's sails, changing their angle or partially furling them to maintain optimal speed. The workers feeding logs had to match their advance rate to the saw's current speed. The whole operation was this delicate dance between wind conditions, mechanical capacity, and human coordination. Different types of wood required different approaches. Oak, which was preferred for ship frames because of its strength and durability, was hard and dense, requiring slower cutting speeds and more frequent blade sharpening. Pine, used for masts and some deck planking, was softer and could be cut faster but was more prone to splitting if the saw bound. Elm, popular for keels because it resisted rot when submerged, was stringy and difficult to cut cleanly. The millwrights and workers had to know all these variations and adjust their technique accordingly. This was skilled industrial work, not just manual labour. The maintenance requirements were considerable. The saw blades needed sharpening every few hours of operation, more frequently when cutting hard oak, less often with softer woods. The crankshaft mechanism had to be lubricated constantly to prevent excessive wear. The windmill's sails needed regular inspection and repair. The timber carriage system, which ran on wooden rails and used mechanical leverage to advance the logs, required adjustment as components wore. The Dutch developed increasingly sophisticated versions of the basic sawmill design as they gained experience. Some mills had multiple saw blades operating simultaneously, cutting several planks from a single log in one pass. Others incorporated specialized equipment for cutting curved pieces needed for ship ribs. These required different blade angles and more complex carriage systems. There were mills specifically designed for cutting the enormous timbers needed for masts, which required extra heavy frames and more powerful mechanisms. The diversity of specialized equipment reflected the sophistication of the Dutch shipbuilding industry and its ability to optimize for specific tasks. The economics of operating these sawmills were compelling, which is why they spread so rapidly once Corneliszoon proved the concept. A mill operating costs were primarily labour, maybe 3 or 4 workers per shift, plus the millwright's wages and maintenance expenses. But a productive mill could process enough timber in a year to build several ships, and the difference between wind-powered sawing costs and hand sawing costs translated to profits that could repay the initial investment in just a few years. This created a gold rush of sorts in the Zaan region. Anyone with capital and access to a good windmill site wanted to build a sawmill. The competition drove innovation as mill owners sought any advantage that would let them process timber faster or cheaper than their rivals. It also drove down timber processing costs, which benefited the entire shipbuilding industry. By the 1620s, sawn timber was so much cheaper in Amsterdam than anywhere else in Europe that it made economic sense to ship raw logs from the Baltic to Amsterdam for processing, then sometimes ship the finished planks elsewhere for use. Amsterdam had become the timber processing centre for Northern Europe, not because it had forests, but because it had technology. The ripple effects extended into related industries. Rope making, which required massive quantities of hemp fibre twisted into precise configurations, benefited from similar mechanisation. The Dutch developed rope walks, long covered buildings where hemp could be spun into rope using mechanical systems powered by horses or wind. These produced stronger, more consistent rope than hand-twisting methods, and they produced it in the massive quantities needed to rig hundreds of ships. A single large ship might need several miles of rope in various thicknesses for its rigging, plus anchor cables that were essentially enormous ropes requiring specialised equipment to manufacture. Sailmaking similarly industrialised. Canvas production involved weaving flax into large sheets, which was traditionally done on hand looms by skilled weavers. The Dutch imported canvas-making expertise from Flanders and France, then scaled it up with improved looms and systematic organisation. They established quality standards so canvas could be graded by weight and strength, which made it easier for shipbuilders to specify exactly what they needed for different sail types. The Amsterdam sailmakers became famous for producing reliable canvas that would survive years of exposure to salt water, sun, and wind without excessive degradation. Not glamorous work, but absolutely essential for maritime commerce. Metalworking for ships required similar advances. Anchors, nails, bolts, hinges, and countless other metal components had to be produced in large quantities to consistent specifications. Dutch blacksmiths and metalworkers developed standardized designs and production techniques that emphasized reliability over artistry. An anchor had to work, not be beautiful. Nails needed to hold firmly without corroding too quickly. Hinges. The practical focus on function meant Dutch ship fittings were sometimes less decorative than those from other countries, but they worked better and lasted longer, which is what actually mattered for commercial operations. The paint ships needed protection from wood-boring marine organisms, rot and weather. The Dutch developed various protective coatings using pine tar, pitch and other materials, applied systematically to different parts of ships depending on exposure conditions. The smell of these materials being processed, boiling tar and mixing paints, was apparently notable enough that visitors to the Zaan region commented on it regularly. Not exactly a pleasant industrial perfume, but the price of maritime dominance. All of these supporting industries clustered around the shipyards, creating what modern economists would call an industrial cluster or ecosystem. If you were a skilled metalworker and wanted to maximize your income, moving to the Zaan region made sense because that's where the work was. Same for rope makers, sailmakers, carpenters, and everyone else connected to maritime industries. This concentration of expertise created additional competitive advantages. Shipyards could find skilled workers locally, suppliers could develop close relationships with their customers, innovations could spread quickly through networks of craftsmen who knew each other. The whole system became more efficient because all the pieces were in close proximity and constantly interacting. The management systems that evolved to coordinate all this activity were also innovative. Large shipyards operated with what we'd now recognize as project management techniques. They tracked materials, scheduled work, allocated labor, and monitored costs with detailed written records. The VOC's shipyards in Amsterdam had administrative staff whose entire job was managing the paperwork of ship construction, tracking timber deliveries, recording worker hours, authorizing payments, and ensuring projects stayed on budget. This bureaucratic infrastructure might seem tedious, but it allowed for construction at a scale and efficiency that wouldn't have been possible with informal personal management approaches. The Dutch also developed sophisticated approaches to quality control. Ships were inspected at various stages of construction to ensure they met specifications. The VOC had detailed standards for everything from timber quality to rope strength to paint thickness. These weren't arbitrary bureaucratic requirements. They were based on practical experience about what was needed for ships to survive the brutal conditions of a voyage to Asia and back. A ship that failed inspection had to be corrected before the company would accept it, which created strong incentives for builders to meet standards consistently. This systematic approach to quality was unusual for the era and contributed to the reliability of Dutch ships. Financial innovation supported the industrial expansion. Entrepreneurs could borrow money to build sawmills or shipyards, using the expected future revenue as collateral. Investors could buy shares in shipbuilding ventures without having to personally manage construction. Insurance markets developed that let shipbuilders hedge against various risks. Amsterdam's financial sophistication and industrial capacity reinforced each other. Neither alone would have been sufficient, but together they created overwhelming competitive advantage. The labour force in these industries was diverse and increasingly specialised. At the bottom of the hierarchy were general labourers who moved materials, cleaned work sites, and performed various unskilled tasks. These jobs above them were semi-skilled workers who specialised in particular tasks, operating sawmill equipment, mixing paints, shaping wood, jobs that required some training but not years of apprenticeship. At the top were master craftsmen, shipwrights, millwrights, master rope makers, who designed systems, supervised work, and trained the next generation. This hierarchy was more fluid than traditional guild systems, with more opportunity for skilled workers to advance based on demonstrated ability rather than formal credentials. Women participated in this industrial economy primarily in supporting roles, making the clothing sailors needed, providing food services, managing the households of workers, and occasionally working in less physically demanding parts of rope making or sail mending. This was still a heavily male-dominated industry, especially the shipyard work itself, but the broader maritime economy created employment opportunities that touched families throughout the region. A shipyard worker's wife might take in laundry from sailors or sell food to workers during breaks. Children might run errands or help with light tasks. The entire community was integrated into the maritime economy in various ways. What had been agricultural land and scattered villages became an almost continuous industrial zone. The windmills dominated the landscape, hundreds of them at the height of Dutch shipbuilding, their sails turning whenever wind permitted. The canals were crowded with boats transporting timber, finished ships, and various goods. Warehouses and workshops lined the waterways. The whole area hummed with activity and smelled of industrial processes. It was, in many ways, a preview of the industrial landscapes that would become common during the 19th century, but 200 years early. The strategic importance of this industrial capacity became obvious during conflicts. When the Dutch went to war with England in the 1650s and 1660s, their ability to replace lost ships quickly gave them a significant advantage in the naval campaigns. The English could win battles, but the Dutch could absorb losses and rebuild their fleets faster than the English could capitalise on victories. This wasn't just military capacity, it was industrial capacity translated into strategic advantage. The famous admirals of these wars, Tromp and de Ruyter for the Dutch, Blake and Monk for the English, were operating within constraints set by their respective nations' shipbuilding capabilities as much as by their tactical skills. The knowledge transfer from shipbuilding into other industries was also significant. The organisational techniques developed for managing large-scale ship construction were applicable to other complex projects. The standardisation principles that made Dutch shipbuilding efficient could be adapted to other manufacturing. The crankshaft mechanisms pioneered in sawmills influenced the design of other industrial equipment. Dutch technological leadership in maritime industries spilled over into broader industrial expertise that benefited the entire economy. There were, of course, darker aspects to this industrial dominance. Working conditions in shipyards and sawmills were dangerous by modern standards. Industrial accidents were common. Men fell from ships under construction, got caught in machinery, were injured by falling timber or breaking equipment. There was no workers' compensation, no safety regulations, no real medical care beyond what folk remedies could provide. If you were injured badly enough that you couldn't work, you and your family might quickly find yourselves destitute despite whatever wages you'd earned previously. The prosperity of Dutch maritime industries was built partly on accepting these casualties as just the cost of doing business. The environmental costs mentioned earlier but worth emphasising were substantial. The appetite for timber was nearly insatiable. Forests in Scandinavia were extensively logged to feed Dutch sawmills. The Baltic region's ecology was transformed by commercial forestry driven by Dutch demand. The industrial processes themselves created pollution that affected water quality, air quality, and public health in the shipbuilding regions. These externalities weren't calculated into the cost of ships or figured into anyone's profit calculations. They were just absorbed by the environment and the communities affected, which was standard for pre-environmental regulation economies, but still represented real costs. The skills developed in Dutch shipyards were valuable enough that other countries tried to lure workers away. England repeatedly attempted to recruit Dutch shipwrights and millwrights to transfer their expertise. Some went, attracted by generous offers or opportunity for advancement. But transplanting individual skilled workers without the broader industrial ecosystem they came from proved difficult. A Dutch shipwright working in England might know how to build better ships, but without access to cheap processed timber, standardized components, and experienced workers, their knowledge couldn't be fully applied. This demonstrated something important about industrial development. Technology transfer requires more than just moving technical knowledge. It requires replicating entire systems. By the mid-1600s, the Dutch competitive advantage in shipbuilding was well understood throughout Europe. It was studied, analysed, envied, and targeted. Other nations made various attempts to match or surpass Dutch capabilities. The English Navigation Acts, passed in 1651 and strengthened in subsequent decades, were specifically designed to reduce English dependence on Dutch shipping by requiring English goods to be carried in English ships. These mercantilist policies accepted that they couldn't match Dutch efficiency directly, so they'd use legal force to protect English shipping from Dutch competition. This was economic warfare by other means, and it would eventually contribute to actual wars between England and the Dutch Republic. But in 1602, when the VOC was chartered and Amsterdam was just beginning its rise to global commercial dominance, these future conflicts weren't yet apparent. What was apparent was that the Dutch had figured something out that gave them a massive competitive edge in maritime commerce. That edge rested on foundations of wind-powered industrial production, systematic organisational approaches, standardised manufacturing, and sophisticated financial systems that mobilised capital efficiently. The sawmill invented by Cornelis Zoon was one piece of this larger puzzle, but it was a crucial piece that made many of the others possible. The modern world's industrial economy traces its ancestry back to many sources, but the Dutch shipbuilding industry of the late 16th and early 17th centuries deserves recognition as one of the earliest examples of sustained industrial development at substantial scale. It demonstrated that systematic application of technology and organisation could create productivity gains that translated into market dominance. It proved that standardization and systematization could be more powerful than craft tradition and individual skill. These lessons would be relearned and reapplied during the Industrial Revolution 2 centuries later, but the Dutch had already demonstrated the basic principles in the shipyards of Zaandam. So when we think about Amsterdam's role in building the modern world, we should picture not just merchants in fine houses along canals trading shares on the stock exchange, but also millwrights adjusting windmill sails, workers feeding logs into mechanical saws, shipwrights assembling standardized components into vessels that would dominate global trade. The glamorous financial capitalism of Amsterdam's golden age rested on this industrial foundation. Takeaway: the VOC's commercial empire depended on having better, cheaper ships than their competitors. Amsterdam's financial markets depended on having profitable enterprises to invest in. The city's prosperity depended on being the indispensable centre of maritime trade, and that indispensability was built in the workshops and shipyards as much as in the counting houses and exchange building. The modern world wasn't just financed into existence, it was also built, quite literally, by thousands of workers applying new technologies and organisational methods to the practical problem of moving goods across oceans more efficiently than anyone had managed before. Not as romantic as the story of bold merchants adventuring to the Indies, perhaps, but probably closer to the actual historical reality of how commercial dominance is achieved and sustained. The comparative analysis here is worth spelling out explicitly, because it really drives home just how significant the Dutch advantage was. Let's look at what it took to build and operate a large cargo ship in different European countries around 1600, and you'll see why the Dutch came to dominate maritime trade so thoroughly. In England, building a ship of, say, 200 tons cargo capacity, a decent-sized merchant vessel but not enormous, required first acquiring timber, which had to be cut by hand using pit saws. This timber processing alone might take several months and require paying teams of sawyers skilled wages for sustained periods. The actual ship construction, done in relatively small shipyards by craft guilds operating under traditional methods, would take another 6 months to a year. Total cost might be around £3,000 sterling, and you'd need a crew of perhaps 30 to 40 men to sail it, costing several £100s per year in wages alone. The ship might last 15 or 20 years if well maintained, but repairs would be expensive because everything had to be custom fitted. In Portugal or Spain, the situation was similar but often worse. Iberian shipbuilding remained oriented toward military vessels even for commercial purposes. producing heavily built, expensive ships designed for durability and defense rather than economic efficiency. Construction times were long, costs were high, and crew requirements were substantial. The Spanish in particular favoured large carracks that might carry only slightly more cargo than a Dutch fleet, but required twice the crew and cost substantially more to build. These were impressive ships, certainly, but economically they couldn't compete with Dutch alternatives for routine cargo hauling. In France, the French had excellent shipwrights and built fine vessels, but they couldn't achieve the scale of production or the cost efficiency that the Dutch managed. French merchant shipping remained smaller in total capacity and less competitive in freight rates throughout the 17th century, despite various government efforts to promote maritime commerce. Now compare all this to the Dutch approach. That same 200-ton cargo ship could be built in Amsterdam in perhaps 4 to 6 months using standardized components produced in quantity. The timber would be processed by wind-powered sawmills at a fraction of the hand-sawing cost. Construction would follow systematic methods in a shipyard set up for efficient production rather than craft tradition. The final cost might be 40% less than an English-built equivalent, and crucially, the ship would be designed to operate with a crew of 15 or 20, half the English requirement, through clever design features that reduced labour needs. Operating costs would be proportionally lower throughout the ship's working life. They weren't slightly better than competitors. They were dramatically, overwhelmingly better on the metrics that mattered for commercial success: construction cost, operating cost, and turnaround time. An English merchant competing against Dutch shippers was playing an unwinnable game. Even if he had access to the same markets and cargo, his cost would be so much higher that he'd struggle to make profits that his Dutch competitors achieved routinely. This cost advantage translated directly into market share. If a merchant in Hamburg or Lisbon or London needed to ship goods, hiring a Dutch vessel was usually the most economical option. Why use an expensive English ship when a Dutch ship could carry the same cargo for lower rates? Why wait for a Portuguese vessel when Dutch ships were more readily available? The rational economic choice, time and again, was to use Dutch shipping. This meant money flowing into Dutch hands, Dutch sailors getting employment, Dutch shipyards getting orders for more vessels. The whole system fed itself in a virtuous cycle from the Dutch perspective, or a vicious cycle from everyone else's viewpoint. The VOC's operations demonstrated this advantage at the larger scale. The company maintained a fleet of specialised East Indiamen that were larger and more expensive than typical fleets. These ships might cost 50,000 guilders to build and outfit, but they still embodied Dutch efficiency principles. A Vok ship might carry 800 tons of cargo with a crew of 180 men, which sounds like a lot until you realise a comparable Portuguese vessel would need 250 or more crew for the same cargo capacity. Over a 2-year voyage to Asia and back, the savings in wage costs, food and water, not to mention the extra space available for cargo instead of crew supplies, added up to substantial sums that went straight to profit. The company's ability to build and operate ships at this scale and efficiency was a key factor in its commercial success. The VOC could afford to maintain dozens of ships operating simultaneously on the Asia route, with multiple expeditions departing each year. The English East India Company, by contrast, struggled to maintain even a small fleet due to higher construction and operating costs. The French companies that attempted to compete in Asian trade were even more constrained. The Dutch could simply overwhelm competitors through volume and efficiency, maintaining pressure that made it difficult for rivals to establish sustainable operations. The strategic implications extended beyond pure commerce. Naval power in this era was closely tied to merchant shipping capacity. A country with a large merchant fleet had a ready reserve of ships that could be converted to military use, experienced sailors who could crew warships, and shipyards capable of building vessels for the navy. The Dutch, with their enormous merchant marine, had all these advantages. When conflicts arose, they could rapidly expand their navy by hiring or requisitioning merchant vessels, crewing them with experienced sailors, and building new warships in yards already operating at high capacity. The English recognised this clearly, which is why their mercantilist policies became increasingly focused on building up domestic shipping at Dutch expense. The Navigation Acts weren't really about free trade versus protectionism, they were about national security and economic development. England couldn't afford to remain dependent on Dutch shipping, both because it meant wealth flowing to a potential enemy and because it left England strategically vulnerable. The Acts were a form of forced import substitution, accepting short-term economic inefficiency to build long-term capacity. These policies ultimately worked, though it took decades. By the early 1700s, English shipbuilding had adopted many Dutch techniques and was becoming competitive. English ships were being built with improved efficiency, operating with smaller crews, and incorporating design features learned from captured or purchased Dutch vessels. The English also developed their own timber processing innovations and shipyard organisation methods. It was a classic case of catching up through technology transfer, learning by doing, and sustained investment in developing industrial capacity. But that catching up process required conscious effort over generations. It didn't happen automatically just because Dutch methods existed and were visible. England had to invest in building sawmills, training workers, reorganising shipyards, and accepting lower initial profits while they climbed the learning curve. They had to create markets for standardised components. All the supporting infrastructure had to be built, not just the superficial techniques copied. The fact that it took English shipbuilding half a century to become truly competitive with Dutch methods shows how substantial the Dutch advantage was. The social and cultural impact of this industrial development in the Netherlands was also significant. The Zaan region and Amsterdam became places where technical expertise was valued and rewarded. A skilled millwright or master shipwright had social status that reflected their economic importance. This was different from traditional aristocratic societies, where social status derived from birth, land ownership, or military service. In the maritime industries of the Dutch Republic, you advance based on demonstrated capability in practical commercial activities. This meritocratic element, limited though it was, attracted ambitious people and encouraged innovation. The work culture that developed in these industries emphasized reliability, efficiency, and practical results over tradition or aesthetic considerations. This wasn't a place for elaborate craftsmanship that took years to perfect. It was a place for getting ships built quickly, correctly, and cheaply. The values that made sense in this environment — punctuality, standardization, quantification, systematic organization — were values that would later characterize industrial capitalism more broadly. The Dutch maritime industries were teaching these values to thousands of workers who internalized them as just how serious commercial work was done. Education and training adapted to support industrial needs. Young men who wanted careers in maritime industries learned arithmetic, technical drawing, and practical engineering rather than classical languages and philosophy. There were informal apprenticeships where millwrights taught their craft to assistants, where master shipwrights trained younger builders, where rope makers passed on their specialized knowledge. This wasn't formal schooling in a modern sense, but it was systematic training that created a skilled workforce capable of maintaining and advancing Dutch technological leadership. The accumulation of this technical knowledge created path dependencies that reinforced Dutch advantages. Each generation of millwrights refined techniques and solved problems, creating accumulated wisdom about what worked and what didn't. Each cohort of shipwrights added to the understanding of optimal design features. The knowledge wasn't written in textbooks. Most of it was tacit knowledge embedded in communities of practice, but it was real and valuable. When you build thousands of ships and operate hundreds of sawmills over decades, you learn things that can't be easily transferred to competitors who lack that hands-on experience. The industrial accidents mentioned earlier deserve more attention because they reveal something about how these industries actually functioned. Safety was not a priority in the modern sense. Equipment was dangerous, work proceeded at whatever pace maximized output, and injuries were treated as unfortunate but inevitable. Workers developed informal safety practices. Experienced sawmill operators learned to listen to equipment sounds that indicated problems developing. Shipyard workers learned to watch for warning signs before structures failed. But these were personal survival skills, not systematic safety programs. When serious accidents occurred, the consequences fell entirely on workers and their families. A man crippled in a shipyard fall might receive some assistance from his craft guild if he belonged to one, or from church charity, but there was no expectation that employers had responsibility for workplace safety or worker injuries. The Industrial Revolution in workplace safety wouldn't happen until the 19th century, after decades of labour organising and reform efforts. In 1600s Amsterdam, getting hurt on the job was your problem, not your employer's. The environmental degradation also deserves fuller consideration. The Dutch appetite for timber was so intense that it had measurable impacts on forest ecosystems hundreds of miles away. Scandinavian forests were logged at unsustainable rates to supply Dutch mills. The Baltic region's ecology shifted as timber became a major export commodity. Within the Netherlands itself, local forests that hadn't already been cleared for agriculture disappeared to feed shipyards and sawmills. By the mid-1600s, the Dutch were almost entirely dependent on imported timber, which made them economically vulnerable to supply disruptions, but also meant they'd already consumed their own forest resources. The pollution from industrial processes was equally significant. Boiling tar and pitch created toxic fumes that affected air quality in shipbuilding areas. Paint production using lead and other metals created waste that contaminated water and soil. The sheer density of industrial activity in the Zaan region meant these impacts were concentrated rather than dispersed. Modern environmental studies of the region have found evidence of this historical contamination still present in sediments and soil. The workers who lived and laboured in these conditions experienced health impacts that shortened lifespans and caused chronic illnesses, though these effects wouldn't have been understood in modern terms at the time. Yet despite these costs, or perhaps because people didn't fully recognise them as costs, the Dutch industrial model was seen as successful and worthy of emulation. The VOC's profits, Amsterdam's prosperity, and Dutch commercial dominance were the visible results. The injured workers, polluted landscapes, and depleted forests were treated as background conditions, not as challenges that needed addressing. This pattern of prioritising economic growth while externalising environmental and social costs would, of course, become characteristic of industrial capitalism as it developed over subsequent centuries. The Dutch were pioneers in this respect too, though not in a way anyone should celebrate. The comparative advantage in shipbuilding that the Dutch achieved also had implications for colonialism and global power dynamics that would play out over centuries. Ships were the technology that enabled European expansion into Asia, Africa, and the Americas. The nation that could build and operate ships most efficiently had tremendous advantages in projecting power globally. Dutch commercial dominance in the 17th century rested on shipbuilding capacity. British imperial dominance in the 18th and 19th centuries, similarly, depended on the Royal Navy's ability to build and maintain fleets larger than any competitor could match. The connection between industrial capacity and global power was being forged in Amsterdam's shipyards decades before it became obvious to everyone. The VOC's activities in Asia, establishing trading posts, negotiating treaties, occasionally waging war against local rulers or European competitors, were all enabled by Dutch shipbuilding advantages. The company could maintain military forces in Asia because they could ship soldiers and supplies efficiently. They could sustain commercial operations thousands of miles from home because they could rely on steady streams of ships arriving with goods and capital. They could outlast competitors because they had the logistical capacity to maintain operations even when facing setbacks. All of this traced back, at least partly, to Cornelis Corneliszoon's sawmill and the industrial complex that grew from that initial innovation. There's a certain irony in the fact that this industrial revolution in shipbuilding, which was so important for Dutch commercial success, remained relatively unknown compared to the financial innovations happening in Amsterdam at the same time. The VOC and the stock exchange get chapters in history books. The sawmills and shipyards of Zaandam get footnotes if they're mentioned at all. Yet in terms of actual impact on commercial outcomes, the industrial advantage was probably more important than the financial innovations. You can't make money trading spices if you can't transport them efficiently, and the Dutch could transport them more efficiently than anyone else primarily because of their superior shipbuilding. This reflects a broader pattern where financial and commercial developments get more historical attention than industrial and technological ones, perhaps because they seem more dramatic, or because they're easier to document through written records. But the industrial foundations are often what make the financial superstructure possible. Amsterdam's merchants could invest confidently in Asian trade partly because they knew Dutch ships would deliver competitive advantages. The stock exchange worked partly because there were genuinely profitable enterprises to invest in, and those enterprises were profitable partly because of industrial efficiencies. As we move forward in our story toward London and eventually New York, this lesson about the importance of industrial capacity will remain relevant. London's rise would similarly depend on developing industrial capabilities, though different ones than Amsterdam's, alongside financial innovations. New York's emergence would rest on transportation advantages and industrial development as much as on financial markets. The pattern Amsterdam established, that commercial and financial dominance requires industrial foundations, would repeat across different cities and different technologies. But in 1602, Amsterdam had figured this out first. They'd created an industrial system that could mass-produce ships more efficiently than anyone else. They'd developed the financial systems to fund this industrial capacity. They'd built the commercial networks to employ all these ships profitably. And they'd created the physical urban infrastructure to support the whole enterprise. It was an integrated system where each piece reinforced the others, creating competitive advantages that seemed almost insurmountable to rivals trying to catch up. The workers in the shipyards and sawmills probably didn't think about it in these grand terms. The merchants investing in shipbuilding ventures were thinking about profits and returns, not about reshaping global commerce. The millwrights and master builders were solving immediate technical problems, not consciously building the foundation of modern industrial capitalism. But collectively, all these individual efforts added up to something historically significant: the first sustained industrial economy operating at substantial scale in Europe, creating competitive advantages that would shape global commerce for a century. So when we tell the story of how Amsterdam helped build the modern world, we need to give proper credit to the Industrial Revolution in shipbuilding that made everything else possible. The sawmills and shipyards deserve to be remembered alongside the stock exchange and the VOC. Cornelis Corneliszoon deserves recognition alongside the merchants who chartered the company. The thousands of workers who built the ships deserve acknowledgement alongside the merchants who profited from them. The unglamorous industrial side of Amsterdam's golden age was just as important as the celebrated financial innovations, and probably more important in determining actual commercial outcomes. And with that understanding of how industrial capacity enabled commercial dominance, we're ready to see how these innovations spread and evolved as they moved to London, where the English would adapt Dutch methods to their own circumstances, creating their own path to maritime and commercial supremacy. But that's a story for the next chapter. Now that we understand how Amsterdam built ships better than anyone else, we need to talk about what they did with all the money those ships generated. Because here's the thing about revolutionary industrial capacity: it doesn't matter much if you can't organise the financial and physical infrastructure to exploit it effectively. The Dutch had figured out how to build ships efficiently, but they still needed to solve two other problems: how to mobilise enormous amounts of capital for risky long-distance trade, and how to house the thousands of people flooding into Amsterdam to participate in this booming economy. The solutions they developed, the world's first true stock exchange and Europe's first systematically planned urban expansion, were just as revolutionary as the shipbuilding innovations, and they'd have even longer-lasting impacts on how modern cities and economies function. Let's start with the financial piece, because the VOC's structure as a joint stock company was genuinely unprecedented in ways that are easy to miss if you're used to modern corporations. We've mentioned that the VOC was chartered in 1602, combining the competing Dutch trading companies into a single entity with monopoly rights to Asian trade. But the really innovative part wasn't the monopoly. Monopolies were common enough. The innovation was how the company was structured and how ownership worked. Traditional merchant ventures, which had been the standard model for centuries, operated like this. A group of investors would pool money for a specific voyage. The ship would sail, carry out trade, and return. If you wanted to fund another voyage, you'd organise a new venture. This worked fine for individual expeditions, but it had serious limitations for sustained commercial operations. Every voyage required organising new financing. Investors couldn't easily exit before a voyage completed. You were locked in until the ship returned, which might take years. And there was no way to accumulate capital for long-term investments like permanent trading posts or warehouses in Asia. The VOC threw out this model entirely. Instead, investors bought shares in the company itself, not in specific expeditions. Those shares entitled holders to a portion of whatever profits the company generated, distributed as dividends, but the shares themselves retained value independent of any particular voyage. This might sound like an obvious way to organise a business, but in 1602 it was radically innovative. They were creating a separation between the company's operations and the investment in the company. Two things that had previously been inseparable. Here's why this mattered so much. If you owned shares in the VOC, you didn't have to wait years for a specific voyage to return to access your capital. You could sell your shares to someone else at any time. The buyer would take over your ownership stake and your right to future dividends. The company's operations would continue regardless of these ownership transfers. This created liquidity, the ability to convert your investment back into cash without disrupting the underlying business. And liquidity, it turns out, is enormously valuable. Investors will accept lower returns if they know they can exit an investment whenever they choose, which means a liquid investment structure can raise capital more cheaply than an illiquid one. The initial capital raising was impressive by any standard. The VOC sold shares to anyone willing to buy, from wealthy merchants investing thousands of guilders to modest craftsmen buying a single share. They ultimately raised about 6.5 million guilders from roughly 1,800 investors. This was an enormous sum, probably equivalent to several years' worth of the Dutch Republic's entire tax revenue. No single group of merchants could have assembled this much capital using traditional methods, but by opening investment to a broad base and offering liquidity through tradable shares, the VOC could tap into capital that wouldn't otherwise have been available for risky Asian trade. Now here's where things get interesting from a financial innovation perspective. Almost immediately after the VOC issued its shares, people wanted to trade them. Someone who'd invested in 1602 might need cash in 1603 for other opportunities. Someone else might have saved money and want to invest in VOC shares to participate in the profits. Supply and demand for shares emerge naturally, and where there's supply and demand, there's going to be a market, whether anyone officially creates one or not. Initially, this trading happened informally, shareholders meeting in taverns or on street corners to negotiate prices. I'll sell you my VOC shares for X guilders per share. I'll give you Y guilders. They'd bargain, agree on a price, and complete the transaction, probably with a handshake and maybe a drink to seal the deal. Not exactly sophisticated financial infrastructure, but it worked for small-scale trading. The problem was that as the volume of trades increased, this informal system became inadequate. How did you find buyers or sellers? How did you know if the price someone quoted was fair? How did you prevent fraud? The Amsterdam city government, recognizing both the economic importance of VOC share trading and the potential for chaos in an unregulated market, decided to create formal infrastructure for securities trading. In 1608, they commissioned a purpose-built exchange building where shares could be traded in an organized fashion. This wasn't complete altruism. The city would collect fees and taxes on trading activity, and orderly markets were good for Amsterdam's reputation as a commercial centre. But regardless of motivation, the result was revolutionary. The world's first formal stock exchange, built specifically to facilitate trading in corporate shares. The Amsterdam Stock Exchange building, completed in 1611, was elegantly simple in design, an open courtyard surrounded by covered arcades where merchants could gather regardless of weather. The courtyard had some columns for posted notices and maybe some benches, but mostly it was just open space where people could congregate and conduct business. No trading floor with electronic tickers, obviously. This was the 17th century. But the basic function was the same as modern exchanges, providing a centralized location where buyers and sellers could find each other efficiently. The way trading actually worked in this exchange was fascinating and honestly kind of chaotic by modern standards. There were no official market makers or formal price discovery mechanisms. Instead, VOC shares at 135, someone might shout, indicating they'd buy at that price. Selling at 142, someone else would counter. If a buyer and seller agreed on a price, they'd complete the transaction on the spot, recording it in their own ledgers, and maybe having a witness or a notary confirm it for larger trades. The actual share certificates would be transferred later, often with considerable paperwork to ensure proper record keeping. Some traders spread false rumours to move prices in favourable directions. I heard the latest VOC fleet was lost at sea. Watch the price drop, then buy cheap before the truth emerged. Or conversely, the company's profits are going to be enormous this year. Price rises, sell high, then laugh when reality disappoints. This kind of manipulation was so common that the city had to establish rules against spreading false information to influence stock prices. These were probably the world's first securities fraud regulations, created because Amsterdam's traders proved immediately that any system that could be gamed would be gamed. Short selling emerged almost as quickly as the exchange itself started operating. This is the practice of selling shares you don't actually own, betting that the price will fall so you can buy them back cheaper later and pocket the difference. This created situations where the same shares might be sold multiple times by different people, none of whom actually owned them, leading to settlement crises when everyone tried to deliver shares that didn't exist. Not exactly a robust market structure, but it demonstrated that financial innovation and financial chaos often emerge together. The VOC's management, the Heeren 17, watched all this secondary trading with mixed feelings. On one hand, a liquid market for shares was good. It made it easier to raise capital in the future if investors knew they could sell out easily. On the other hand, they had no control over what happened to share prices based on speculation and rumours. The company might be performing well, but if speculators drove down the price, that looked bad. Or the price might rise based on unrealistic expectations, then crash when reality disappointed, causing scandal. The separation between the company's actual operations and the market's perception of those operations was complete, and sometimes very uncomfortable for management. Dividend policy became a crucial tool for managing investor expectations. The Heeren 17 had to decide how much of the company's profits to distribute as dividends versus retaining for reinvestment in operations. Too little dividend and shareholders would complain and possibly sell, driving down the price. Too much dividend and the company wouldn't have capital for necessary investments in ships, trading posts, and military operations. They had to balance short-term investor satisfaction against long-term strategic needs, which is exactly the dilemma modern corporate boards face. The VOC's management was learning these lessons through trial and error, setting precedents that would influence corporate governance for centuries. The information flow between VOC operations in Asia and shareholders in Amsterdam was another challenge. Ships took 18 months or more to sail to the East Indies and back, which meant news about what was happening in Asian trade was always severely delayed. A fleet might have arrived safely in Java, established profitable trade, and departed for home, but shareholders wouldn't know any of this for months or years. In the meantime, they were making investment decisions based on stale information, rumours, and speculation. This information asymmetry created opportunities for insiders who had access to company information before the general public, and predictably, some people exploited this for profit. The VOC tried to manage this by controlling information releases carefully. But information leaked constantly. Ship captains would talk to family and friends, crew members would gossip in taverns, and anyone with connections inside the company could potentially learn material information before it became public. Amsterdam was a relatively small city where everyone in the merchant community knew each other, so information spread quickly through informal networks. The modern concept of insider trading didn't exist yet, but the practice certainly did. Share prices fluctuated based on all sorts of factors beyond the company's actual performance. Wars between European powers affected shipping safety and thus VOC prospects. Conflicts with local rulers in Asia could disrupt trade. Even weather reports mattered. If ships were overdue and storms were reported, prices might fall on fears of losses. This is basically what modern financial markets do with corporate news, earnings reports, and economic data. But the VOC shareholders were figuring it out organically, without any theoretical framework or regulatory guidance. The social dynamics of the exchange were also noteworthy. The trading wasn't purely transactional. It was embedded in social relationships among Amsterdam's merchant community. Deals were often made based on personal trust and reputation rather than just price. If you were known as reliable, people would trade with you on better terms than if you had a reputation for sharp dealing. The exchange courtyard became a place not just for trading, but for networking, gossiping, and maintaining social relationships. Business and social life weren't separated the way they often are in modern professional contexts. Different merchants developed different trading strategies and philosophies. Some bought VOC shares and held them long-term, collecting dividends and viewing them as a stable investment in Dutch commercial power. Others traded actively, trying to profit from price fluctuations by buying low and selling high. Some specialized in derivatives and forward contracts, agreements to buy or sell shares at a future date at an agreed price, which let them speculate without needing capital to buy shares outright. The diversity of approaches and the constant interaction between different types of traders created a sophisticated market that was discovering price discovery mechanisms through practice. The wealth being created through VOC dividends and share price appreciation was substantial. Early investors who'd bought shares in 1602 and held them saw their investment appreciate considerably while also collecting regular dividends. The annual dividend in good years might be 20 or 30% of the share price, which by modern standards is extraordinary. Not every year was good, of course. Some years the company paid minimal or no dividends when expenses were high or voyages went poorly. But over time, VOC shares proved to be enormously profitable investments for patient holders. This success attracted more investment into the stock market generally, creating demand for other tradable securities. Other companies and ventures started issuing shares that could be traded on the Amsterdam Exchange. The stock market was becoming a general mechanism for capital formation, not just a way to trade VOC shares. Amsterdam was inventing equity finance as a systematic tool for economic development, though again, nobody involved would have described it in those terms. They were just solving practical problems about how to fund expensive enterprises and allow investors to manage risk. The exchange building itself became a landmark of Amsterdam, a symbol of the city's commercial power and financial sophistication. Foreign visitors would tour it, astonished by the volume of trading and the amounts of money changing hands. The exchange was open for several hours each day, and during trading hours the courtyard would be packed with hundreds of merchants conducting business, shouting prices, negotiating deals, and generally creating an atmosphere of intense commercial energy. It must have been quite a spectacle. Nothing quite like this existed anywhere else in the world. Now, parallel to all this financial innovation, Amsterdam was dealing with a very different but equally pressing challenge: where to put all the people who were flooding into the city to participate in this booming economy. Between 1590 and 1640, Amsterdam's population roughly tripled, from maybe 30,000 to over 100,000. That's an insane growth rate by pre-modern standards, and it created enormous pressure on housing, infrastructure, and public services. The medieval city core was packed beyond capacity, with buildings subdivided into smaller and smaller units, streets clogged with traffic, and sanitation becoming increasingly problematic. Something had to be done, and what Amsterdam chose to do was genuinely revolutionary in the history of urban planning. The solution, approved by the City Council in 1593 and implemented over the following decades, was the Canal Belt, the Grachtengordel. This wasn't a modest expansion, adding a few streets to the city outskirts. This was a comprehensive plan to roughly triple the city's footprint through systematic expansion based on rational design principles. 3 major canals, the Herengracht, Keizersgracht, and Prinsengracht, would arc around the old city centre in concentric semicircles. Smaller radial canals and streets would connect these main canals at regular intervals. The land between the canals would be divided into standardised plots that would be sold to private developers who'd build houses according to city-specified regulations. The engineering challenge was formidable. Amsterdam sits on reclaimed marshland with a high water table, which means digging canals and building on the surrounding land requires extensive foundation work. Every canal had to be excavated with the sides reinforced with wooden pilings to prevent collapse. The excavated soil, and there was an enormous amount of it, had to be moved somewhere, generally being used to raise the level of adjacent plots so they'd be above the water table. Every building would need to rest on wooden foundation piles driven deep into the clay beneath the peat soil, with a number of piles depending on the building's size and weight. A typical merchant house might need 100 or more foundation piles, each driven by hand using pile drivers, basically heavy weights dropped repeatedly onto wooden poles. The labour involved was staggering. The city organised this work systematically, much like a modern development project. They hired contractors to dig the canals and prepare the plots. They established specifications for foundation work and building construction. They created a permitting system so they could review building plans before construction started. They even specified architectural details like minimum street widths, building setbacks, and facade designs to ensure the expansion would be visually coherent. This level of planning and regulation was unprecedented in European urban development. Most cities just grew organically, but Amsterdam was going to engineer its growth. The aesthetic vision behind the canal belt was interesting. It aimed for a kind of prosperous harmony rather than grandeur. The canals themselves were pleasant but not spectacular, maybe 25 or 30 metres wide, lined with trees, with small bridges crossing them at regular intervals. The buildings were specified to be tall and narrow, typically just 20 or 25 feet wide but 3 or 4 stories high, which maximised the number of houses that could fit along the canals while maintaining the narrow frontage style traditional in Amsterdam. This created a distinctive streetscape, rows of narrow tall houses with stepped gable roofs, all roughly similar in scale but with individual variations in detail and decoration. The economic logic was straightforward. Canal front property was valuable because it offered direct access to water transport, important in a city where most goods moved by boat, and because it was prestigious. The city could charge premium prices for these plots, funding the expansion's cost. Behind the main canals, less expensive plots were available for more modest housing. This created a natural economic stratification, with wealthy merchants building grand houses on the main canals and artisans, shopkeepers and workers occupying the less expensive areas. Not exactly egalitarian, but it allowed for housing diversity that served different economic classes. The construction boom was enormous. Hundreds of new houses were built each year at the height of the expansion. This created huge demand for building materials, brick, timber, glass, tile, and for skilled construction workers. Brickmakers, carpenters, glaziers, and labourers all found steady employment in the building trades. The VOC, the global trade network, was directly supporting the city's physical expansion. The canal belt's design included features we'd now associate with urban planning, but that were quite unusual for the 1600s. There were specified areas for different types of activities: residential areas along the main canals, commercial areas near the harbour, industrial areas in less central locations. There were public spaces, including small parks and squares where residents could gather. There were regulations about waste disposal, and requirements that property owners maintain the canal walls and streets in front of their buildings. This was a systematic approach to creating a functional urban environment rather than just maximising density. The plot system was particularly clever from a financial perspective. The city would create the infrastructure, dig the canals, lay out the streets, prepare the plots, then sell the plots to private buyers who'd build their own houses. The sale price reflected the land's value plus the city's infrastructure investment. Buyers had to commit to building within a specified time frame and had to meet building code requirements. This system let the city guide development without having to actually construct all the buildings themselves. It was a public-private partnership avant la lettre, with the public sector providing infrastructure and regulation, while private capital funded the actual construction. Speculation in building plots became common. Some merchants bought multiple plots, built houses, then sold them at a profit, essentially early property development. Others bought plots purely as investments, holding them briefly and reselling to actual builders at higher prices. This speculation drove up plot prices, which annoyed people who needed housing and enriched people who got in early. But it also helped fund the city's expansion by maximising revenue from plot sales. Amsterdam's government seemed okay with the speculation as long as plots were eventually developed and the city got its revenue. The physical result of all this planning was spectacular. By the mid-1600s, Amsterdam had the most beautiful and coherent urban landscape in Europe. The canal belt was a triumph of water management, engineering, and aesthetic design. Walking along the canals, which remains one of the great urban experiences, you'd see tree-lined waterways, elegant houses with distinctive gable roofs, small bridges arcing over the water, boats moving goods through the city, and everywhere a sense of prosperous order. This wasn't the chaotic medieval density of most European cities, nor was it the formal, monumental grandeur of royal capitals. It was something different, rational, commercial, and distinctly Dutch. The houses themselves reflected Amsterdam's merchant culture. They were elegant but not ostentatious. The facades were brick, sometimes with stone accents, with large windows to let in light, important in a northern climate with limited daylight much of the year. The narrow frontage meant houses were deep, extending back from the canal with rooms arranged one behind another. The top floors often had hoists for lifting goods into storage areas, because these weren't just residences, they were often also warehouses and workshops. The integration of commercial and residential space was typical of merchant houses globally, but Amsterdam's version was particularly well adapted to the city's needs. The social geography of the canal belt revealed Amsterdam's values and priorities. The Keizersgracht, Emperor's Canal, was slightly less prestigious, and the Prinsengracht, Prince's Canal, was more mixed between residential and commercial uses. But the differences were relative. Even the lesser canals housed substantial wealth. Behind these main canals, in the smaller streets and on the smaller canals, lived everyone else: artisans, shopkeepers, skilled workers, and the various people who made the merchant economy function. This proximity between different economic classes was typical of pre-modern cities, though Amsterdam's version was more orderly than most. The canal belt expansion continued for decades, gradually filling in the space between the original plan's boundaries. Later phases added additional canals and neighbourhoods, including the Jordaan district, initially developed for workers and craftsmen, though it's now one of Amsterdam's most fashionable areas. The city kept growing, adapting the original plan's principles to new circumstances. By 1700, Amsterdam had roughly 200,000 residents, all housed in an urban environment that remained remarkably functional despite the density. The model Amsterdam created influenced urban planning across Europe and eventually globally. Other cities studied Amsterdam's approach and adapted elements for their own expansions. The idea that cities could be planned systematically rather than just growing organically was revolutionary, and Amsterdam proved it could work. The use of water features, canals, as both infrastructure and aesthetic elements became common in planned cities. The integration of private development within public planning frameworks became a standard approach. Amsterdam had created a template that others would follow with variations. But beyond the specific planning techniques, Amsterdam demonstrated something more fundamental: that urban space could be treated as a designed system rather than just accumulated historical accident. This system's level thinking about urban space was genuinely new, and would become increasingly important as cities grew larger and more complex during industrialization. The connection between Amsterdam's financial innovations and its urban planning success wasn't coincidental. Both emerged from the same pragmatic commercial culture that emphasized practical results and systematic organization. The Dutch were good at identifying problems, how to fund expensive ventures, how to house a growing population, and developing rational solutions that worked at scale. Whether the problem was organizing share trading or organizing urban space, the approach was similar. Figure out what needs to happen, design systems to make it happen efficiently, and implement systematically with attention to practical details. The wealth generated by VOC dividends and other commercial activities provided capital for the canal belt construction. Successful merchants who'd made fortunes from Asian trade built grand houses along the new canals, displaying their wealth through architecture while also creating housing demand that justified further expansion. The shipbuilding industry's workers needed housing, creating demand in less expensive areas. All of these achievements were interconnected, each reinforcing the others. The stock exchange wouldn't have mattered without profitable companies like the VOC to trade. The ship, and none of the modern world's financial and urban systems trace direct lineage to what Amsterdam created in these decades. Stock exchanges in London, New York, Tokyo, and everywhere else are descendants of Amsterdam's exchange, adapted and evolved but based on the same fundamental principles. Urban planning as a professional discipline emerged from examples like Amsterdam's canal belt, where comprehensive systematic design proved superior to organic growth. The integration of public and private development, the use of land sales to fund infrastructure, the regulation of private building through codes and standards, all of these are now standard practice in urban development. But Amsterdam pioneered them in the early 1600s. None of this was inevitable. Amsterdam could have succeeded commercially without inventing the stock exchange. They could have continued using traditional merchant venture structures and probably would have done fine. They could have let the city grow organically rather than planning the canal belt expansion. It would have been messier, but probably workable. The fact that they innovated in both financial and urban organizations simultaneously was partly luck, partly the Dutch culture of systematic problem-solving, and partly the presence of enough wealth and ambition to attempt large-scale projects. But the results spoke for themselves. By the mid-1600s, Amsterdam was demonstrably the most advanced city in Europe in terms of financial sophistication, commercial organization, and urban design. Visitors from other countries were consistently impressed, sometimes intimidated by what the Dutch had achieved. This wasn't ancient Rome's grandeur or Paris's royal magnificence. It was something newer and in some ways more modern, a city organized around commerce and finance rather than political or religious power. Amsterdam was showing what a commercial republic could build when it applied wealth, technical skill, and systematic thinking to urban development. The question, of course, was whether this dominance could last. Amsterdam's advantages in the early 1600s were substantial but not permanent. Other nations could copy Dutch techniques, other cities could build stock exchanges, other governments could adopt systematic urban planning. The English in particular were watching everything Amsterdam did with intense interest, taking notes, and thinking about how to compete. London would eventually challenge and surpass Amsterdam's commercial dominance, but that's a story for our next chapter. For now, let's just appreciate what Amsterdam achieved. Inventing modern financial markets and modern urban planning more or less simultaneously, creating models that would shape how cities and economies function for centuries to come. Not bad for a merchant republic built on reclaimed marshland. Let's dig deeper into some of the specific mechanisms that made Amsterdam's stock exchange so innovative, because the devil really is in the details here. The challenge the exchange had to solve was fundamentally one of information and trust. How do you create a market where buyers and sellers who don't necessarily know each other can transact with confidence? How do you establish fair prices when there's no central authority setting them? Amsterdam's solutions to these problems, developed through trial and error over decades, established patterns that modern financial markets still follow. One key: early on, trades were informal agreements that might be disputed later. Did we actually agree on that price? Were we both sober when we shook hands? As trading volume increased, these disputes became more common and more disruptive. The solution was to require written contracts for significant transactions, with specific terms about the number of shares, the price, the settlement date, and the obligations of both parties. These contracts could be enforced through Amsterdam's commercial courts, which gave both buyers and sellers confidence that their agreements would be honoured. Settlement procedures evolved to handle the practical logistics of transferring share ownership. Initially, the VOC maintained a register of shareholders, and ownership transfers required both parties to appear at the company's offices to record the change. This was cumbersome and time-consuming, creating friction in the market. Eventually, the system became more flexible, with shares being represented by transferable certificates that could change hands without immediate notification to the company. The certificate itself became the proof of ownership, which made trading much more efficient but also created opportunities for fraud if certificates were forged or stolen. The emergence of professional brokers and dealers was another important development. These were individuals who specialized in facilitating trades between buyers and sellers, taking commissions for their services. A broker might maintain relationships with multiple buyers and sellers, knowing who was looking to trade and at what prices. When someone wanted to buy or sell shares, they could work through a broker rather than having to find a counterparty themselves. This intermediation improved market efficiency significantly. Brokers could match buyers and sellers more quickly and at better prices than individuals could on their own. Some brokers evolved into dealers who would buy shares for their own account, holding inventory that they could sell to customers on demand. If you needed to sell VOC shares quickly, a dealer might buy them even without having a buyer lined up, betting that they could resell at a profit later. The development of options and futures contracts added another layer of sophistication to Amsterdam's financial markets. An option gave the holder the right, but not the obligation, to buy or sell shares at a specified price before a certain date. This let investors hedge risks or speculate on price movements without committing full capital up front. Futures contracts obligated both parties to complete a transaction at a future date at an agreed price. These derivatives expanded trading possibilities enormously, but they also increased complexity and created new opportunities for manipulation and disputes. Price discovery in the Amsterdam Exchange happened through a process that economists would later call continuous auction. There was no single official price at any moment. Instead, prices emerged from ongoing negotiations between multiple buyers and sellers. If more people wanted to buy than sell, prices would rise as buyers competed for limited shares. If more people wanted to sell, prices would fall as sellers competed for limited buyers. This mechanism aggregated information from all market participants, with prices reflecting the collective assessment of the share's value. It wasn't always perfectly efficient. Rumors and manipulation could distort prices, but it was more effective than any alternative mechanism available at the time. Information dissemination became crucial to market functioning. Traders needed to know about VOC operations, dividend announcements, geopolitical developments affecting trade, and anything else relevant to share values. An informal information industry emerged, with newsletters and pamphlets reporting on commercial news, ship arrivals, and market gossip. These publications weren't always accurate. Some spread deliberately false information to manipulate markets, but they provided at least some common information base for traders to work from. The coffeehouse culture of Amsterdam facilitated information sharing, with merchants gathering to discuss news and rumors over drinks. The social networks among Amsterdam's merchant community played a huge role in how markets functioned. Trust and reputation mattered enormously when legal enforcement was uncertain and information was imperfect. If a merchant was known for honest dealing, others would trade with them on better terms and with less formality than with someone of questionable reputation. Social sanctions, being excluded from trading networks, losing access to credit, being gossiped about negatively, could be as powerful as legal penalties in enforcing norms of honest behavior. The exchange wasn't just a place for anonymous transactions, it was a social institution embedded in the broader merchant community. Amsterdam's city government established some basic rules. Trading had to occur during specified hours in the exchange building, certain types of fraud were prohibited, and disputes could be brought to commercial courts for resolution. But there was no equivalent to modern securities regulation, no disclosure requirements, no prohibition on insider trading, no position limits or circuit breakers. The assumption was that merchants were sophisticated enough to look after their own interests, and if they lost money through bad trades or manipulation, that was their problem. Caveat: this light touch regulation had advantages and disadvantages. On the plus side, it allowed rapid innovation, new trading strategies, new types of contracts, new market structures could emerge without needing regulatory approval. The market could evolve organically in response to participants' needs. On the downside, it left investors vulnerable to various forms of abuse. Pump and dump schemes, where traders would artificially inflate prices through false rumors then sell at the peak, were common. Cornering markets, accumulating enough shares that you could manipulate the price was possible. Information asymmetry between insiders and ordinary investors could be exploited systematically. The market was efficient in some ways, but far from fair. Bubbles and crashes were features of Amsterdam's stock market from early in its history. Prices would sometimes rise far beyond what any reasonable assessment of company fundamentals would justify, driven by speculation and momentum trading. Everyone knew prices were probably too high, but as long as they kept rising, it seemed profitable to keep buying. Eventually, something would trigger doubt. A disappointing dividend announcement, geopolitical shock, or just exhaustion of new buyers, and prices would crash as everyone tried to sell simultaneously. These boom-bust cycles caused real economic damage, with fortunes made and lost based partly on skill, but largely on timing and luck. The famous tulip mania of 1636-1637, while not directly involving the stock exchange, emerged from the same speculative culture that Amsterdam's financial markets had created. The mechanisms were similar. Futures contracts on tulip bulbs traded at ever higher prices based on expectations of continued price increases, until the bubble suddenly burst and prices collapsed. The fact that this happened in Amsterdam rather than elsewhere wasn't coincidental. The city had developed the financial infrastructure and speculative mindset that made such manias possible. You could argue that tulip mania was just the stock market's trading culture applied to flowers, with predictably absurd results. The VOC's dividend policy became increasingly sophisticated as management learned how to use it for strategic purposes. In good years, they'd distribute generous dividends to keep shareholders happy and maintain the stock price. In lean years, they might still pay modest dividends to signal confidence in the company's future, even if it meant drawing down reserves. Sometimes they'd pay dividends in goods rather than cash, spices for instance, which shareholders could then sell themselves. This saved the company the trouble of converting Asian goods to cash before distribution, though it meant shareholders had to handle the logistics of selling pepper or cloves or whatever they'd received. The relationship between share prices and the underlying economic reality of VOC operations was often tenuous. The company might be doing well operationally, trade flowing smoothly, reasonable profits being earned, but if expectations had been for even better performance, the stock price might fall. Conversely, this disconnect between operational performance and market perception was confusing and frustrating for VOC management, who felt they were being judged on factors partly beyond their control. But it was an inherent feature of having publicly traded shares. The market would believe what it wanted to believe, regardless of what company management said. The accumulation of wealth through VOC shareholding created a new kind of wealthy class in Amsterdam. People who were rich not primarily from active trading or manufacturing, but from passive investment returns. These dividend aristocrats, if we can call them that, represented something relatively new in European society, a rentier class whose income came from financial assets rather than land or trade. They could live comfortably on their VOC dividends without working, or they could use the dividend income to fund other investments or conspicuous consumption. This was early financial capitalism, creating a new social structure alongside the established merchant and land-owning elites. Now, the water management alone was a massive engineering challenge. Amsterdam's location in a river delta with a high water table meant that water was constantly trying to flow into any excavation. The canals had to be designed to maintain proper water levels, not so high that surrounding buildings flooded, not so low that boat traffic became impossible. The solution involved complex systems of locks, sluices, and drainage channels that regulated water flow through the city. Each canal had to be connected to the city's broader waterway network in ways that allowed both transportation and water management. Boats needed to be able to move through the canal system, bringing goods to warehouses and removing waste. But the canals also had to integrate with the defensive moats and waterways that protected the city, which required coordinating with military considerations. And the water quality had to be maintained. Canals couldn't be allowed to become stagnant, which required regular flushing with fresh water from outside the city. All of this had to be engineered as an integrated system, not just individual canals dug in isolation. The construction process itself was carefully organized. The city would award contracts for digging specific sections of canal, with detailed specifications about dimensions, side reinforcement, and timelines. The contractors would hire labourers, often migrants from rural areas looking for work, and oversee the actual excavation. This was brutal physical work, digging through peat and clay with hand tools, moving enormous quantities of soil, and working in wet, muddy conditions. Not exactly a pleasant job, though the wages were apparently decent enough to attract workers. The excavated soil, as mentioned, was used to raise the level of adjacent building plots. This required coordinating the canal digging with the plot preparation. You couldn't just pile dirt randomly. It had to be spread and packed properly to create stable building foundations. Some was moved in barges through the canal system, some was carted by wagons along temporary roads, and all of it had to be tracked to ensure nothing was wasted and all the building plots received adequate fill. Foundation piles were another major challenge. Each building required dozens or hundreds of wooden piles driven deep into the clay beneath the peat soil. The piles had to reach solid clay to provide stable support. If they didn't go deep enough, buildings would settle unevenly and potentially collapse. Driving piles required specialized equipment and skills. Pile drivers, basically wooden frames with heavy weights that were lifted and dropped repeatedly onto the pile tops, were operated by teams of workers who had to coordinate their efforts carefully. The sound of pile driving echoed across Amsterdam for decades as the canal belt was developed, a constant background noise of urban construction. The quality control for foundation work was critical. Building inspectors would check that piles were driven to proper depth and spacing before allowing construction to proceed. This wasn't just bureaucratic make-work. Improper foundation work really could lead to building collapse, and the city had strong incentives to ensure construction was done safely. The inspectors had to balance thoroughness against speed, making sure standards were met without unnecessarily delaying construction. This required technical expertise and good judgment, and the city invested in training qualified inspectors to do the work. The architectural regulations that governed canal belt construction were detailed and carefully enforced. Buildings had to be brick or stone. Wooden construction was prohibited after several devastating fires demonstrated the risks. Facades had to align with their neighbours to create visual continuity along the canals. Building heights were limited to prevent structures from dominating their neighbours. Windows had to meet minimum size requirements to ensure adequate light and ventilation. Even details like roof pitch and gable design were specified to maintain the aesthetic coherence the city wanted. These regulations weren't purely aesthetic, they served practical purposes too. The requirement for brick construction reduced fire risk. The height, the facade alignment made street cleaning and maintenance easier. Amsterdam's planners understood that regulations could serve multiple purposes simultaneously. Safety, health, aesthetics, and functionality could all be addressed through thoughtful building codes. The streets had to be wide enough for cart traffic and for residents to move around comfortably, but not so wide that they wasted valuable building land. They had to provide adequate fire breaks between buildings, and they had to create a navigable network that let residents and visitors find their way around the city efficiently. The solution was a grid of streets perpendicular to the canals, supplemented by a few radial routes connecting different parts of the city. The bridges crossing the canals were both functional infrastructure and architectural features. They had to be high enough to allow boat traffic to pass underneath, but low enough that the approaches weren't too steep for cart traffic. They had to be strong enough to handle heavy loads, but light enough not to require massive foundations. And they had to look good, because they were highly visible elements of the cityscape. Amsterdam developed standardized bridge designs that met these requirements efficiently, though some bridges on major routes were given more elaborate architectural treatment. The integration of green space into the urban plan was unusual for the time. Trees were planted along the canals, creating shaded walkways and improving the aesthetic experience of the waterways. Small parks and gardens were incorporated into the plan, providing spaces for residents to gather outdoors. Some of the larger merchant houses had private gardens in interior courtyards. This attention to greenery wasn't just decorative. Trees helped stabilize canal banks, provided shade that reduced summer heat, and created a more pleasant urban environment. The Dutch understood that livable cities needed natural elements alongside built infrastructure. The public amenities included in the plan showed thoughtful attention to urban life. There were public bathhouses where people could wash. Private bathing facilities were uncommon in this era. There were market squares where farmers and merchants could sell goods. There were designated areas for specific trades, a flower market, a cheese market, various specialized commercial zones. All of this was planned as part of the urban system, not just left to emerge organically. The financing model for the canal belt expansion was sophisticated and forward-thinking. The city didn't try to fund everything up front from tax revenue, which would have been impossible given the scale of investment required. Instead, they used the future sale of building plots to secure loans that funded the initial infrastructure work. Banks and investors would lend to the city based on projected revenue from plot sales, effectively monetizing future cash flows. As plots were sold and the money came in, it would repay the loans and fund the next phase of expansion. This was municipal finance as a tool for development, using debt strategically to enable projects that wouldn't be possible with pay-as-you-go funding. The risk management in this financing model was interesting. The city was betting that demand for building plots would remain strong enough to generate the revenue needed to repay loans. To mitigate this risk, the city proceeded in phases, completing one section before committing fully to the next. They also varied plot prices based on location and market conditions, adjusting to maintain sales volume, and they maintained reserve funds to cover shortfalls if sales slowed temporarily. This wasn't modern risk management with formal models and stress tests, but it was thoughtful planning about how to handle uncertainty. The social impact of the Canal Belt development was substantial. For wealthy merchants, the new canal front houses represented an opportunity to display their prosperity through architecture. For artisans and workers, the expansion meant more housing availability and hopefully somewhat lower rents than in the overcrowded medieval core, though Amsterdam was never cheap. For the city as a whole, the expansion meant breathing room for growth without the constant pressure of housing scarcity. The Canal Belt also changed Amsterdam's social geography in subtle ways. The medieval city had been densely mixed, with wealthy and poor living in close proximity because there simply wasn't room for spatial segregation. The Canal Belt allowed for more economic sorting, with the wealthy concentrating along the main canals and workers filling in behind them. This wasn't complete segregation. Even the back streets of the Canal Belt had some wealthy residents, and some poorer people lived in subdivided houses on the main canals. But there was more economic stratification than in the old city. Whether this was good or bad is debatable, but it definitely changed the character of urban life. The commercial uses of canal-front properties were also significant. Many ground floors often contained shops or workshops. This integration of commercial and residential space was typical of pre-industrial cities, but Amsterdam's version was particularly well organized, with the canal system providing efficient goods movement and the building regulations ensuring adequate space for both living and working. The maintenance requirements for the Canal Belt were considerable. Canal walls had to be inspected and repaired regularly to prevent erosion and collapse. The canals themselves had to be dredged periodically to remove accumulated sediment and keep them navigable. Trees had to be maintained, streets had to be cleaned, bridges had to be repaired. All of this cost money and required ongoing administration. The city funded maintenance through property taxes, canal usage fees, and various other revenue sources. They also required property owners to maintain the sidewalks and canal walls in front of their buildings, distributing the maintenance burden somewhat. The comparison to how other European cities were growing during the same period makes Amsterdam's achievement more impressive. Most cities were growing organically, with buildings added wherever space could be found, streets following old paths or property lines, and infrastructure improvised as needed. The result was often chaotic, unsanitary, and increasingly dysfunctional as cities grew larger. Paris, London, Rome, all were crowded, dirty, and difficult to navigate in the 1600s. Amsterdam, by contrast, was orderly, clean by contemporary standards, and relatively easy to navigate. The difference was planning versus organic growth, and the advantages of planning were obvious to anyone who visited multiple cities. The Canal Belt's influence on subsequent urban planning can be traced through specific examples. When St. Petersburg was founded in the early 1700s, Peter the Great explicitly modelled elements on Amsterdam's canals. When new towns were established in the Americas and colonies, many incorporated systematic planning principles similar to Amsterdam's. When 19th-century urban reformers looked for examples of how cities could be rationally organised, they often looked back to Amsterdam's Canal Belt as a successful precedent. The influence was sometimes direct, planners studying Amsterdam's approach, and sometimes indirect, through general acceptance that cities should be planned rather than left to grow randomly. The relationship between Amsterdam's financial and urban innovations reinforced itself in interesting ways. The wealth created by stock market trading and VOC dividends funded the demand for expensive canal-front houses. The construction boom in the Canal Belt created employment and economic activity that supported the broader commercial economy. The orderly, attractive urban environment made Amsterdam more appealing to skilled workers and merchants, attracting talent that contributed to economic growth. The financial markets required physical infrastructure, the exchange building, counting houses, warehouses that the urban expansion provided. Each element enabled and enhanced the others in a virtuous cycle of development. By the 1660s, Amsterdam had essentially completed the Canal Belt expansion, creating an urban structure that would remain largely intact for centuries. The city had roughly tripled in size from its medieval footprint. The population had grown from maybe 30,000 to over 150,000. The physical infrastructure, canals, streets, buildings, represented an investment equivalent to decades of the city's total economic output. And it all worked. The canals managed water effectively, boats moved goods efficiently, people lived in relatively comfortable housing, and the whole system functioned as an integrated urban environment. It was a stunning achievement in urban planning and engineering. The stock exchange, meanwhile, had evolved from an informal marketplace into a sophisticated financial institution. Daily trading volume was substantial, with thousands of shares changing hands. The market had developed mechanisms for price discovery, settlement, and dispute resolution. Professional brokers and dealers facilitated trading. Derivative contracts expanded trading possibilities, and the whole system was attracting international participation, with investors from across Europe buying VOC shares and trading in Amsterdam. The city had become the financial capital of Europe not through government decree, but through creating the best marketplace for capital. The connection between these two achievements, financial markets and urban planning, illustrates a key principle about how cities develop and maintain dominance. Success in one area creates resources and attracts talent that enable success in other areas. Amsterdam, the high-quality urban environment, attracted skilled workers and merchants who contributed to commercial success. The urban planning created physical infrastructure that supported financial institutions. Each advantage built on others, creating cumulative dominance that was hard for competitors to challenge. This is the model that London would study and eventually adapt to British circumstances. The English looked at Amsterdam and saw both the power of systematic planning, whether financial or urban, and the vulnerability of depending on advantages that could be copied. They learned that building better cities and better financial institutions required sustained investment and thoughtful organisation, but that the payoffs were enormous. Amsterdam had shown what was possible when a commercial society applied its wealth and intelligence to creating the infrastructure of modern capitalism. But before we get to London's story, we should appreciate just how much Amsterdam accomplished in these crucial decades of the early 1600s. They invented modern finance, revolutionised urban planning, and demonstrated that systematic organisation could create competitive advantages in multiple domains simultaneously. Not bad for a country that was literally below sea level and fighting for its independence at the same time. So while Amsterdam was busy inventing stock markets and digging canals, London was having a rather different experience. It was bigger, maybe 200,000 people compared to Amsterdam's 100,000. But size isn't everything when your city is a chaotic medieval mess of narrow streets, wooden buildings, and spectacularly inadequate sanitation. London had grown organically over centuries, spreading along the Thames without much planning or coordination, and by the 17th century it was showing all the disadvantages of that organic growth. Let's start with how England stumbled into becoming a textile powerhouse, because this story begins not with grand strategy, but with a plague, some sheep, and a lot of dead people. The Black Death of 1348-1350 killed roughly a third to half of England's population, which was obviously catastrophic for the people involved, but had some interesting long-term economic consequences. Before the plague, England was primarily an agricultural economy exporting raw wool to continental Europe, particularly to Flemish textile producers who would turn that wool into valuable cloth. English sheep produced excellent wool, something about the climate and grazing lands, and English landowners were happy to sell it to foreign buyers at good prices. The actual manufacturing of textiles happened elsewhere, which meant the real value added was being captured by Flemish and Italian cloth makers, while England got commodity prices for raw materials. After the plague, the labour shortage fundamentally changed this equation. With fewer workers available, agricultural labour became more expensive, which made traditional farming less profitable. But sheep were different. They required relatively little labour compared to grain crops. You could put sheep on land that had previously been farmed, employ a small number of shepherds instead of many field workers, and generate decent income from wool sales. So landowners across England started converting cropland to pasture, a process that would continue for centuries and would eventually create the romantic pastoral landscapes we associate with the English countryside. Less romantic for the displaced farm workers, of course, who found themselves without employment, but great for sheep. This expansion of sheep farming dramatically increased England's wool production. Just as labour costs made it more attractive to do the manufacturing domestically, rather than exporting raw wool. The problem was that England didn't have the skilled workers or established textile industry to do this processing at scale. Religious conflicts in the Low Countries and France created a steady stream of Protestant refugees fleeing Catholic persecution. Many of these refugees were skilled textile workers, weavers, fullers, dyers, who brought their craft knowledge with them. England, being conveniently Protestant and relatively welcoming to refugees who brought useful skills, became a popular destination. The English government actively encouraged this migration, recognizing that these skilled workers represented valuable human capital that could transform England's economy. Starting in the 1560s and accelerating through the early 1600s, thousands of Flemish and French textile workers settled in England, particularly in London and the surrounding areas. These immigrant craftsmen brought more than just individual skills. They brought entire production techniques, organisational knowledge, and connections to European markets. They established workshops in London, trained English apprentices, and built the foundation for what would become England's textile industry. This wasn't a quick process. It took decades for English textile production to reach the quality levels of continental manufacturers, but by the early 1600s, England was producing significant quantities of finished cloth for both domestic consumption and export. London, as the commercial and political capital, became the centre of this emerging industry. The transformation of London's economy from a wool trading centre to a textile manufacturing and finishing hub changed the city's character fundamentally. The medieval city had been organised around the wool trade, with warehouses for storing wool, a market for trading it, and financial services to facilitate transactions. Now it needed different infrastructure: workshops for weaving, facilities for dyeing and finishing cloth, warehouses for storing finished textiles, and expanded commercial services to handle a more complex export trade. The city's physical structure and economic organisation both had to adapt, though neither adapted particularly well in the crowded medieval city centre. By the 1660s, London was a major textile exporter, with cloth representing something like 80% of England's total exports. This was a remarkable transformation from a century earlier when raw wool dominated exports. The wealth being generated by textile production and trade was enormous, creating a merchant class that rivaled Amsterdam's in prosperity, if not quite in sophistication. The sanitation in 17th century London was, and I'm choosing my words carefully here, absolutely horrendous. The city had no real sewage system. Waste was either thrown into the streets to be washed away by rain, dumped into cesspits that were periodically emptied by night soil men who carted the contents away, or discharged directly into the Thames. The smell must have been spectacular, in the worst possible sense. Disease was endemic. Plague outbreaks happened regularly, most notably the Great Plague of 1665 that killed maybe 100,000 Londoners. The crowded conditions, poor sanitation and lack of clean water created perfect conditions for disease transmission. Not exactly the kind of place you'd want to visit without modern antibiotics and a strong stomach. The housing stock was overwhelmingly wooden, packed tightly together along narrow medieval streets. Buildings often overhung the street, with upper floors extending out over the lower ones to maximise living space within constrained lots. This created streets that were essentially dark tunnels at ground level, with buildings almost touching across the narrow gaps. It was atmospheric, certainly, but also dark, damp, and spectacularly flammable. Fire was a constant threat in cities of this era, but London's combination of wooden construction, narrow streets, and general overcrowding made it particularly vulnerable. Various small fires happened regularly, usually contained to a few buildings before being extinguished. But everyone knew that a fire under the wrong conditions, strong wind, dry weather, could spread rapidly through the city. It was just a matter of time. That time came in September 1666, when a fire started in a bakery on Pudding Lane, and yes, that's really what the street was called, which somehow makes the whole disaster feel slightly more absurd. The baker apparently didn't properly extinguish his ovens before going to bed. Sparks ignited nearby materials, and by early morning his building was ablaze. Under normal circumstances, this might have been contained to that one building, or maybe the immediate neighbours. But September 1666 was not normal circumstances. London had experienced a dry summer, wooden buildings were particularly combustible, and most crucially, a strong east wind was blowing that would push flames westward through the city centre. The fire spread rapidly, jumping from building to building faster than firefighting efforts could contain it. The firefighting technology of the time was primitive. basically bucket brigades and hand-pumped water engines that could spray short distances. The standard fire suppression technique was actually to demolish buildings in the fire's path to create fire breaks, but this required decisive action, and the Lord Mayor reportedly hesitated to order demolitions because he'd have to compensate property owners for their destroyed buildings. By the time he overcame this financial concern and started ordering demolitions, the fire was spreading too quickly for fire breaks to be effective. The wind kept pushing flames westward, igniting building after building, creating a firestorm that would burn for 4 days. The Great Fire of London ultimately consumed about 13,000 houses, 87 parish churches, St. Paul's Cathedral. Miraculously, the death toll was apparently quite low, maybe single digits recorded officially, though this seems improbably small and probably reflects poor record-keeping rather than actual casualties. What's not in doubt is the scale of physical destruction. The commercial heart of England's capital was reduced to smoking ruins. The financial cost was enormous, estimated at the time to be in the millions of pounds, perhaps equivalent to several years' worth of the entire national economy. It was. Now here's. In the immediate aftermath of the fire, there was a brief moment of possibility when London could have been completely reimagined and rebuilt, according to rational planning principles. Several schemes were proposed, most famously one by Christopher Wren, the mathematician and architect who would later rebuild St. Paul's Cathedral. Wren's plan was spectacular: wide boulevards radiating from central squares, buildings set back from streets, public spaces and monuments, the whole city reorganised according to aesthetic and functional principles. It would have made London into something resembling Paris or Rome, a capital city designed for grandeur and efficiency rather than commercial expediency. The plan. London wasn't a blank slate. Even though the buildings were gone, the property boundaries remained, and those boundaries were owned by specific people who had legal rights to rebuild on their land. Implementing Wren's plan would have required overriding all those property rights, compensating owners for land being taken for public spaces, and somehow sorting out who got which plots in the new arrangement. They weren't interested in waiting years while planners and lawyers sorted out a comprehensive redevelopment scheme. So London rebuilt itself, mostly on the old street patterns but with important modifications. The Rebuilding Act of 1667 established new standards. Buildings had to be brick or stone, not wood. They had to meet certain height requirements based on street width, and streets had to be widened where possible. But the basic layout remained medieval. Narrow, winding streets following old property lines, buildings packed tightly together. It was a massive missed opportunity from a planning perspective, but it reflected the political and economic realities of rebuilding in a commercial city where private property rights were paramount and people needed to resume business quickly. What did change significantly was the quality of construction. The new brick buildings were more substantial than the old wooden structures, with better foundations and more sophisticated architecture. Streets were somewhat wider and straighter than before. The new St. Paul's Cathedral, designed by Wren and completed in 1711, was a masterpiece that dominated the city skyline. The overall effect was a city that looked more prosperous and permanent than the medieval wooden jumble it replaced, even if the basic organisation remained chaotic. London. The fire also created opportunities for innovation in how urban development was organised and financed. The rebuilding required enormous capital, and the traditional model of individual property owners rebuilding independently wasn't sufficient for the scale of investment needed. New financial mechanisms emerged: property development syndicates that would acquire multiple adjacent lots, demolish and rebuild comprehensively, then sell or lease the improved properties. Insurance markets expanded dramatically as property owners sought protection against future fire losses. Credit markets developed new instruments for financing construction. The fire accelerated London's financial development, creating mechanisms that would later be applied to other contexts. But the really revolutionary innovation in London urban development came not in the fire-damaged city centre, but in the areas around it, particularly to the west, where aristocratic landowners started developing their estates into residential neighbourhoods. This is where we get the invention of the London Square, one of the most influential urban forms ever created, and the template for residential development patterns that would spread globally. Let's dig into how this happened, because it's a story about real estate speculation, social climbing, and accidentally inventing modern suburbia. The basic situation was this: London was growing rapidly, and wealthy people wanted to live near the city centre for business and social reasons, but didn't want to live in the crowded, dirty city itself. Aristocratic families who owned large estates on London's outskirts, land that had been agricultural or park space, realised they could make enormous profits by converting these estates into residential developments. But they faced a problem. How do you create housing that's urban enough to attract wealthy residents, but pleasant enough to command premium prices? The solution they developed was the residential square, a planned neighbourhood centred on a private park, with elegant terrace houses facing the green space. The model was pioneered in Covent Garden in the 1630s by the Earl of Bedford, though the development was interrupted by civil war and wouldn't be completed as originally planned. The more James's Square developed in the 1670s-1680s. These squares established the template, a large square or rectangular green space, usually fenced and accessible only to residents of the surrounding houses, with elegant terrace houses built in continuous rows around 3 or 4 sides of the square. The houses would be uniform in external appearance, matching facades, consistent heights, coordinated architectural details, but individually owned and internally configured to owners' preferences. This was revolutionary urban form for several reasons. First, public parks existed, but private parks accessible only to adjacent property owners were new. Third, the economics of square development were compelling for landowners. Rather, the developers would construct houses at their own expense than sell or sublet them. This system let landowners monetize their property while retaining long-term ownership and control. It also created incentives for quality construction, since buildings had to last through the lease term and maintain value for resale. The developers who built these houses were engaged in speculative construction. They'd invest capital in building houses they didn't yet have buyers for, hoping to sell them profitably once completed. But successful developers could make substantial profits, and the potential returns attracted investors willing to take the risk. This created a dynamic, entrepreneurial approach to urban development quite different from the organic growth of medieval cities or the state-directed development of places like Paris. The design of terrace houses around squares became increasingly sophisticated as developers competed for wealthy buyers. The typical house was narrow, maybe 20 or 25 feet wide, but deep and tall, often 4 or 5 stories including basement and attic levels. The ground floor would have formal reception rooms. The first floor, what Americans would call the second floor, would have the best rooms for entertaining. Upper floors had bedrooms, the basement had kitchens and servants' work areas, and the attic housed servants' quarters. The rear of the house might have a small private garden or service yard. These houses were designed for families with servants. You needed staff to haul water, tend fires, prepare meals, clean, and handle all the other tasks of daily life. The layout assumed servants would be constantly moving through the house, mostly using back stairs and service areas to avoid disrupting the family's activities. This wasn't housing for ordinary people. These were luxury homes for the wealthy merchant and professional class and minor aristocracy. The squares were effectively creating new exclusive neighbourhoods on former agricultural land, dramatically increasing the land value while providing housing appropriate for London's growing wealthy population. The social dynamics of the squares were carefully managed. Developers and landowners wanted to attract the right kind of residents, wealthy, respectable, socially prominent people whose presence would enhance the neighbourhood's status and maintain property values. This meant both formal restrictions, covenants prohibiting certain commercial uses or limiting who could lease property, and informal social pressure to maintain standards. Living on a fashionable square became a marker of social position. The success of the first square sparked a wave of similar developments. By the early 1700s, London was ringed with planned residential neighbourhoods organised around squares: Bedford Square, Berkeley Square, Hanover Square, Grosvenor Square, and dozens of others. Each followed the basic template but with variations in size, grandeur, and social prestige. The impact on London's urban form was profound. The city was growing westward in a relatively organised fashion, with each new square development adding a planned neighbourhood that connected to the existing city. This wasn't comprehensive citywide planning. Each square was developed independently by different landowners, but it created more order than pure organic growth would have. The result was a city with a chaotic medieval centre surrounded by progressively more orderly and planned neighbourhoods. Not Amsterdam's systematic canal belt, but not medieval chaos either. Something in between that reflected English political culture's emphasis on private property rights and market-driven development. The squares also established a model for separating residential and commercial areas. The squares were explicitly residential, shops and workshops were generally prohibited to maintain the genteel character. Commerce remained concentrated in the city centre and along major roads, while the squares provided quiet, clean residential environments. This separation of uses became a fundamental principle of urban planning, though it would later be criticised for creating sterile residential neighbourhoods and killing street life. But in the 17th century, when city centres were dirty, noisy and smelly, the appeal of separate residential areas was obvious. The financing mechanisms developed for square construction became templates for real estate development more broadly. The ground lease system, where landowners retained ownership while developers built and sold improvements, was copied across England and eventually exported to colonies and former colonies. The use of restrictive covenants to maintain neighbourhood character influenced zoning law development. The speculative construction model, where developers built housing before having specific buyers, became standard practice in market-based economies. London's squares were laboratories for inventing modern real estate development practices. The architectural language of the squares, Georgian terraces with their elegant proportions, regular windows and classical details, became synonymous with upscale British housing. This style, the global influence of London's architectural forms, traces directly to the squares, developed in the decades after the Great Fire. When you see elegant Georgian terraces anywhere in the former British Empire, you're seeing the descendants of London's square development model. The social aspirations embedded in square development were interesting and sometimes contradictory. On one hand, the squares were creating new elite neighbourhoods accessible to wealthy merchants and professionals, not just hereditary aristocracy. On the other hand, the squares were specifically designed to be exclusive, with prices and social norms that excluded everyone except the wealthy. The environmental impact of square development was significant. Agricultural land around London was converted to urban use at a rapid pace. The green spaces within squares were artificial landscapes, carefully maintained gardens rather than natural areas. The construction required enormous quantities of brick, timber and other materials, with the environmental costs of those materials being externalised to resource extraction areas. The maintenance and governance of squares required new institutional forms. Residents would form associations or committees to manage the shared spaces and enforce standards. These weren't exactly homeowners' associations as we'd recognise them today, but they served similar functions, collecting fees, maintaining common areas, setting rules, and resolving disputes. This private governance of semi-public spaces was another innovation that would influence urban development long after the original squares were built. The failure to implement Wren's comprehensive plan for rebuilding London after the fire is often portrayed as a missed opportunity, and from a pure planning perspective, it was. But it was faster. London rebuilt within a decade rather than taking decades for a comprehensive plan to be implemented. It respected property rights, which was important in a country where property ownership was central to political power, and it allowed for experimentation and diversity, different developers trying different approaches, with successful models being copied and unsuccessful ones abandoned. This was messier than planned development, but it was also more adaptive and responsive to actual demand. The combination of textile wealth, fire-driven reconstruction, and square development transformed London from a medieval commercial town into a recognisably modern capital city. By 1700, London was Europe's largest city, probably around 575,000 people, and it was growing rapidly. The city centre was rebuilt in brick and stone with wider streets and better buildings. The docks. London wasn't as systematically organised as Amsterdam, but it was dynamic, wealthy and increasingly dominant in global commerce. The textile industry that had driven much of this growth continued to expand through the 1700s, with English cloth increasingly competitive with continental European production. The skills brought by Flemish and French refugees had been fully absorbed, and England was developing its own innovations in textile production. The combination of abundant wool from domestic sheep farming, skilled workers, access to capital through London's financial markets, and strong export demand created a virtuous cycle of growth. Textile manufacturing spread beyond London to other parts of England, but London remained the commercial centre where cloth was traded, financed and distributed globally. The English East India Company, founded in 1600 as a competitor to the Dutch VOC, was finally starting to find success by the late 1600s. The company had struggled in its early decades, unable to match Dutch commercial and military power in Asian waters. But English persistence, combined with strategic opportunities created by declining Portuguese power and conflicts between the VOC and various Asian rulers, allowed the English company to establish profitable operations. The company's success would eventually make it one of the most powerful commercial enterprises in history, though that's getting ahead of our story. For now, the coffeehouse culture that emerged in London during the late 1600s played a role analogous to Amsterdam's exchange courtyard in creating spaces for commercial information sharing and deal-making. London's coffeehouses became informal commercial centres where merchants, ship owners and traders would gather to hear news, discuss deals and make connections. Different coffeehouses specialised in different types of commerce. There was one where maritime insurance business was conducted that would eventually evolve into Lloyd's of London, others where commodity trades were arranged, others where stock transactions occurred. This decentralised approach was very English, multiple informal venues rather than a single organised exchange, but it served similar functions of facilitating commerce through information sharing. The London Stock Exchange wouldn't be formally established until the early 1800s, much later than Amsterdam's exchange, but informal stock trading happened in coffeehouses and other meeting places from the late 1600s onward. The same, where Amsterdam created formal institutions, London relied more on informal networks and gentlemen's agreements. Where Dutch commercial culture emphasised written contracts and legal frameworks, English commercial culture relied more on personal relationships and reputation. Both approaches worked, just differently. The relationship between London and Amsterdam during this period was complex, partly competitive, partly complementary, partly collaborative. English merchants envied Dutch commercial success and tried to copy their methods while also trying to undermine Dutch dominance through naval warfare and protectionist policies. The Navigation Acts requiring English goods to be carried in English ships were explicitly anti-Dutch and caused several Anglo-Dutch wars in the mid-1600s. But English merchants also did business with Dutch counterparts, used Amsterdam's financial markets when convenient, and hired Dutch experts to teach English shipbuilders and manufacturers. It was by the early 1700s, the balance was starting to shift in England's favour. London was growing faster than Amsterdam, English trade was expanding more rapidly, and British military power was starting to outmatch Dutch capacity. The reasons were partly geographic. Britain's island position provided strategic advantages, partly demographic. England had a larger population than the Dutch Republic, and partly institutional. The political stability following the Glorious Revolution of 1688 created favourable conditions for commercial development. Amsterdam, the destruction forced reconstruction that modernised the building stock and improved infrastructure. The rebuilding created opportunities for financial innovation and real estate development experimentation. Obviously, the suffering of people who lost homes and businesses was real and shouldn't be minimised, but from an urban development perspective, the fire accelerated changes that probably would have happened eventually, but much more slowly and painfully, through gradual replacement of obsolete buildings. The square development model similarly emerged from specific English circumstances, aristocratic land ownership patterns, strong property rights, market-driven development norms, but created an urban form that proved broadly applicable. The combination of private green space, uniform facades, and speculative development could be adapted to different contexts while maintaining the basic appeal of planned residential neighbourhoods for wealthy residents. What London demonstrated, perhaps more clearly than Amsterdam, was that urban development didn't require comprehensive state planning or control to achieve relatively orderly results. Market forces, guided by property rights and light-touch regulation, could produce functional cities that accommodated rapid growth. This wasn't ideal from a planning perspective. There were inefficiencies, inequities, and missed opportunities for optimization. But it worked, and it worked in ways that were politically acceptable in societies that valued property rights and market mechanisms. The London model of urban development would become dominant in the English-speaking world, while the Amsterdam model of more comprehensive planning would influence continental European approaches. Both were. The connection between economic transformation, from wool to textiles, and urban transformation, from medieval chaos to brick-and-mortar reconstruction to square development, illustrates how cities evolve in response to economic changes. London's physical form adapted to accommodate a textile-based commercial economy, with workshops and warehouses for cloth production and trade, residential areas for the wealthy merchants managing that trade, and financial infrastructure to fund and facilitate commerce. The city that emerged wasn't perfectly planned, but it was reasonably well suited to its economic functions, which is arguably all an urban form needs to be. The city had the economic base of a thriving textile industry, the infrastructure of reconstructed commercial areas and new residential squares, the financial capacity of developing capital markets, and the political backing of an increasingly powerful nation-state. Amsterdam's lead was substantial. The Dutch still had better ships, more sophisticated financial markets, and longer established trade networks. But London was catching up quickly, and the trajectory was clear. The story Amsterdam achieved dominance through systematic planning, comprehensive organisation, and technical innovation in shipbuilding and finance. London achieved comparable results through economic transformation driven by trade and immigration, recovery from catastrophic fire, and entrepreneurial real estate development. This suggests that there's no single correct model for urban development. Different approaches can work depending on circumstances, institutions, and cultural values. As we'll see when we turn to New York, the American city would borrow from both Amsterdam and London while adding its own innovations. But that's ahead of us. For now, not as systematically planned as Amsterdam perhaps, but ultimately just as effective in creating the urban infrastructure to support commercial capitalism and global trade. The English had figured out their own path to modernity, one that emphasized market mechanisms, property rights, and entrepreneurial initiative within loose regulatory frameworks. This London model would have enormous influence on how English-speaking cities developed globally, spreading patterns of urban form and real estate development that remain visible today in cities from Boston to Sydney to Hong Kong. Not bad for a city that had to burn down first to really modernise. Let's dig deeper into the actual mechanics of how London's textile industry functioned, because understanding this helps explain why the city developed the way it did. The transformation from raw wool to finished cloth involved multiple distinct processes, each requiring different skills and facilities. First, the raw wool had to be cleaned and carded, combing the fibres to align them for spinning. Then it had to be spun into yarn, which required either hand-spinning wheels or increasingly more sophisticated spinning equipment. The cloth. What made this interesting from an urban development perspective was that different stages of production happened in different locations. But the final stages, weaving complex patterns, dyeing with expensive dyes, finishing to high standards, increasingly concentrated in London where skilled craftsmen, access to capital, and proximity to merchants and markets made operations more efficient. The Flemish and French refugee workers who brought textile skills to London weren't a homogeneous group. They came from different regions with different specializations. Some were experts in fine woolen cloth, others in lighter fabrics called new draperies that mixed wool with other fibers. Some specialized in dyeing, particularly the complex processes needed for vibrant, color-fast colors. Others excelled at finishing techniques that gave cloth its final quality and appearance. This diversity of expertise meant London could produce a wide range of textile products, from relatively cheap cloth for mass markets to luxury fabrics for wealthy buyers. The guild system that governed craft production in medieval London had to adapt to accommodate these immigrant workers. The traditional guilds tried to restrict who could practice trades, requiring long apprenticeships and membership fees that kept numbers limited and wages high. So London's guilds either relaxed their rules for textile workers, or the textile industry operated partly outside guild control. This created tensions between traditional craftsmen protecting their privileges and a growing industry that needed labour flexibility. The workshops where textile production happened were typically small-scale operations, a master weaver with a few apprentices and journeymen, working in a building that served as both residence and workspace. The noise of looms operating, the smell of dyes and finishing chemicals, and the general bustle of production meant textile districts were distinct parts of the city. You could tell by sound and smell when you'd entered an area where cloth production was concentrated. The financing of textile production involved complex credit relationships. Raw materials, wool, dyes, chemicals, had to be purchased before cloth could be sold, which required working capital. This merchant-dominated financing meant that actual producers, the weavers and dyers, often operated with thin margins, while the merchants who organized trade captured most of the profits. Not exactly. The export trade in finished textiles required its own infrastructure. Cloth had to be inspected for quality, measured, marked, and packaged for shipment. The black merchants who specialized in export trade would buy cloth at these markets, arrange shipping to continental Europe or other destinations, and handle the logistics of international trade. This created another layer of middlemen between producers and ultimate consumers, each layer taking a cut of the value chain. The wealth accumulation among successful textile merchants was substantial enough to reshape London's social structure. Men who'd started as craftsmen or small traders could, with luck and skill, build fortunes rivaling those of landed gentry. These newly wealthy merchants wanted to live in ways that reflected their success, which meant demanding housing of quality and style appropriate to their status. The relationship between textile wealth and real estate development was direct and symbiotic. Merchant property. The squares became both residential neighborhoods for the textile elite and investment vehicles for deploying textile profits. This integration of commercial and real estate wealth created a unified upper class whose interests aligned around continued commercial growth and urban expansion. The architectural details of square development reveal a lot about the values and priorities of this emerging upper class. The house facades were elegant but not ostentatious, understated wealth rather than flashy display. The emphasis was on proportion, balance, and classical details rather than elaborate decoration. This aesthetic reflected both English cultural values about gentility and moderation, and practical considerations about costs. Elaborate carved stone details were expensive, while well-proportioned brick facades with simple trim could achieve elegance more economically. The interior organization of these houses reflected assumptions about domestic life that seem strange to modern sensibilities. The basement kitchens meant all food had to be carried upstairs to dining rooms, often getting cold in transit. The placement of servants' quarters in attics meant they had to climb multiple flights of stairs constantly, while carrying water, coal, and various items needed for household operation. The formal separation between areas of the house for family versus servants created physical manifestations of social hierarchy. Servants would use back stairs and passages, remaining largely invisible to the family and any guests. Not exactly efficient by modern standards, but the point wasn't efficiency, it was maintaining social distinctions. The private gardens at the centres of squares were surprisingly large. Some were several acres. These weren't elaborate formal gardens like you'd find at country estates, but they were substantial green spaces with trees, walkways, and sometimes features like fountains or statues. This privatized green space meant that the wealthiest residents had access to park-like settings without the city needing to create public parks, a very English solution that maximized amenity for those who could afford it while minimizing public expense. The social dynamics within squares were fascinating and sometimes fraught. Residents were theoretically social equals, all wealthy enough to afford houses on the square, but in practice there were fine gradations of status based on the size and location of one's house, family background, and social connections. The square gardens became spaces where these status distinctions played out through subtle social interactions. Who acknowledged whom, who was invited to which social events, who held which positions on the garden committee. All of this mattered intensely to people who cared about social position. Not exactly. The development process for squares involved risks and rewards that attracted entrepreneurial developers willing to gamble on London's continued growth. A developer would negotiate a lease from the landowner, commit to building houses according to specified standards within a certain time frame, and put up capital for construction. If anything went wrong, sales slowing, construction costs overrunning, economic downturn hitting, the developer could face bankruptcy. These were high-stakes ventures that required both capital and nerve. Some developers specialized in different segments of the market. Others focused on more modest squares serving the upper middle class, less prestigious but also less risky. Still others would build single terraces or small groups of houses rather than entire squares, taking smaller bites of the development opportunity. This diversity of approaches created a range of housing options that served different segments of London's wealthy population. The construction workforce for square development was substantial and diverse. Master builders oversaw projects, hiring specialized craftsmen for different tasks: bricklayers, carpenters, plasterers, glaziers, painters, and various others. Much of this work was seasonal. Construction slowed or stopped in winter when cold weather made some tasks difficult or impossible. Workers might be employed steadily on one project for months, then face unemployment between jobs. The boom in square construction created strong demand for skilled building trades, driving up wages and attracting workers from rural areas or other parts of England. Each house required thousands of bricks, tons of timber, hundreds of window panes, large quantities of lime for mortar and plaster, iron for hardware and reinforcement, lead for roofing, and countless other materials. Multiply this by dozens of houses being built simultaneously across multiple square developments, and you get some sense of the demand this created for building materials. The Thames became a major artery for transporting bricks, timber, and other bulky materials to construction sites. Brickfields on London's outskirts expanded to meet demand. Timber imports from Scandinavia increased. An entire supply chain evolved to support the construction boom. The timing of square development roughly coincided with important changes in England's economy and society beyond just textiles. Agricultural productivity was increasing through enclosure and improved farming methods, freeing labour for urban occupations while generating wealth that could be invested in London property. Colonial trade was expanding, creating new sources of wealth from sugar, tobacco, and other commodities. The financial revolution of the late 1600s, founding of the Bank of England, development of government debt markets, expansion of joint stock companies, increased the capital available for all kinds of investments, including real estate. London's property boom was part of a broader economic transformation that was making England wealthier and more commercially sophisticated. The construction consumed enormous quantities of timber at a time when England's forests were already depleted from centuries of use. The expansion of the built-up area meant agricultural land being converted to urban uses, reducing food production near the city and requiring more distant sources of supply. The Thames was increasingly polluted by industrial and human waste, degrading water quality and affecting fisheries. These environmental costs weren't recognised at the time but were nonetheless real. The governor, London, the city of Westminster, where Parliament and the Royal Court were located, had different governance. The surrounding areas where squares were being developed were in various parishes or manors with their own administration. This fragmented governance made it difficult to coordinate infrastructure provision, maintain standards, or plan comprehensively. It contributed to the ad hoc, market-driven character of London's development. No single authority had the power or desire to impose comprehensive planning. The comparison between London's development pattern and what was happening simultaneously in Paris is instructive. Paris under Louis XIV and his successors was being transformed through royal initiative. Grand boulevards, monumental public buildings, designed squares with royal statues. This was top-down, state-directed urbanism aimed at glorifying the monarchy and demonstrating French power. London's development was messier, more commercial, driven by private interests seeking profits rather than royal glory. Neither approach was objectively better. They reflected different political systems and cultural values. But the contrast shows that there were multiple models for how cities could modernise. The square development model's influence extended far beyond London. As British merchants, administrators, and colonists fanned out across the growing empire, they took London's urban forms with them. Edinburgh's New Town, developed in the late 1700s, explicitly copied London's squares. Dublin saw similar developments. In colonial cities, Calcutta, Bombay, Sydney, Cape Town, British settlers created neighbourhoods organised around squares or gardens in conscious imitation of London. Even in the United States after independence, the square model influenced residential development in cities like Boston, Philadelphia, and Charleston. London's innovations in urban form became globally influential, shaping how English-speaking peoples created cities. The legal frameworks developed for square development similarly spread through the British legal system to colonies and successor states. The ground lease system, restrictive covenants, private governance of common spaces, all of these became standard tools in English property law and were exported globally. American real estate development in particular would be profoundly influenced by these English legal innovations, though adapted to American circumstances in important ways. The connection between London's square development and modern American suburbs runs through these legal mechanisms that allowed private development within frameworks of covenants and restrictions. The social criticism of square development came later, mostly in the 1800s and 1900s, when observers began questioning the equity and efficiency of private development models. Critics noted that squares served only the wealthy, while working-class Londoners lived in increasingly crowded and unsanitary conditions. They pointed out that market-driven development led to inefficient urban form with inadequate infrastructure in working-class areas. These criticisms would eventually lead to reforms, public parks, social housing, comprehensive planning, but that was long after the square model was established. But from the perspective of London's wealthy merchant and professional classes in the late 1600s and early 1700s, the squares were a brilliant solution to their housing needs. They provided elegant homes in pleasant surroundings close to the commercial centre. They created exclusive neighbourhoods that reinforced social status. They offered and they allowed. For the people who had money and power, the system worked well, which is why it persisted and spread. The connection between London's development and the Industrial Revolution that would follow is worth noting. The commercial and financial infrastructure that London developed in the 1600s and 1700s, the textile trade, the financial markets, the real estate development mechanisms, the legal frameworks, created the foundation for industrial development. When textile production began mechanizing in the late 1700s, London's merchants had the capital to invest in factories, the commercial networks to distribute products, and the financial tools to fund expansion. The urban form that emerged from square development would influence how industrial cities organized themselves, separating residential and industrial areas, creating distinct districts for different classes, using private development with minimal public planning. The Great Fire's role in accelerating London's modernisation might make you wonder if catastrophic destruction is actually helpful for urban development. The answer is complicated. The fire certainly forced changes that might otherwise have taken decades to achieve gradually. But the ideal would be modernising without disaster. But sometimes the existing built environment is so entrenched and property rights so rigid that only destruction creates space for change. London's experience suggests that disasters can be catalysts for development, but only if the surrounding conditions, available capital, political will, entrepreneurial energy, are favourable. Destruction alone doesn't guarantee progress. London had successfully transformed its physical infrastructure and economic base in ways that proved durable through subsequent economic changes. By the mid-1700s, London had clearly emerged as Europe's dominant commercial and financial centre, surpassing Amsterdam in most measures of economic activity. The population had grown to perhaps 750,000, larger than Paris, far larger than Amsterdam. The volume of trade flowing through London exceeded other European ports. The development of British military and naval power gave London-based merchants security and reach that the Dutch could no longer match. The residential quarters spreading westward from the city centre housed a wealthy elite whose fortunes from trade, finance and property rivaled those of any aristocracy. London, the model London created, market-driven development within a framework of property rights, light-touch regulation and private initiative, would become the dominant model in the English-speaking world and influence development globally. When former British colonies developed, they generally adopted British legal frameworks and development patterns. The global influence of the London model was immense, shaping how billions of people would eventually live in cities created through private development and market mechanisms. As we'll see when we turn to New York in the next section, the American city would take London's model and push it to logical extremes, creating perhaps the most thoroughly market-oriented urban development in history. But that's a story about taking existing innovations from both Amsterdam and London and adapting them to unique American circumstances and values. For now, we should appreciate London's achievement, creating a model of urban development that balanced private property rights with economic growth, that accommodated rapid expansion without comprehensive planning, and that created an urban form elegant enough to be copied globally. The squares of London weren't perfect. They served the wealthy while neglecting the poor. They consumed agricultural land without much consideration of environmental costs. They created social segregation that reinforced class hierarchies. But they were not bad for an idea that started with aristocrats trying to monetize agricultural estates on the outskirts of a city that had just burned down. So we've travelled through Amsterdam's systematic innovations, London's market-driven transformation, and watched how these two cities essentially invented the template for modern capitalism and urban life. Now we need to talk about what all of this actually means for us today, because here's the thing that might not be immediately obvious. You're living in a world that these three cities built. The apartment or house you live in, the way you invest money, the layout of your city, the entire structure of global capitalism, all of it traces back to innovations pioneered in Amsterdam, London and New York between roughly 1600 and 1850. These were the blueprints that built the modern world, and understanding them helps explain why our cities, our economies and our societies function the way they do today. Let's start with the most obvious legacy, the stock market. Every time someone checks their retirement account, buys shares through a trading app, or hears about the S&P 500 on the news, they're participating in systems that Amsterdam invented with the VOC in 1602. The mechanics have changed dramatically, obviously. Instead of shouting prices in an exchange courtyard, we have electronic trading systems executing millions of transactions per second. But the underlying logic is identical. The modern stock market still grapples with the same basic challenges that Amsterdam's traders faced in the 1600s. How do you prevent insider trading when some people inevitably have better information than others? How do you stop manipulation when prices are determined by what people are willing to pay rather than some objective value? How do you balance the need for liquidity, letting people exit investments easily, with the stability required for companies to plan long-term? These weren't solved problems in 1602, and despite centuries of regulatory development and technological advancement, they're still not fully solved. Amsterdam didn't just invent stock markets, they also invented all the problems that come with stock markets, and we're still figuring out how to handle them. The concept of corporations as permanent entities separate from their owners, which the VOC pioneered, is now so fundamental to capitalism that we barely think about it. But it was revolutionary at the time and remains extraordinarily powerful today. It can accumulate capital at scales no individual could match. It can undertake projects, building infrastructure, funding research, organizing supply chains that require sustained investment over decades. This organizational form enabled the Industrial Revolution, built railroads and telegraph networks, funded scientific research, and organized modern mass production. Without the corporate structure that Amsterdam invented, modern capitalism literally couldn't exist in its current form. The derivatives markets that emerged in Amsterdam, options, futures, various forms of speculation on price movements without owning underlying assets, have evolved into a massive global industry worth hundreds of trillions of dollars. These instruments serve legitimate purposes: companies hedging against currency fluctuations, farmers locking in prices for crops before harvest, investors managing risk across portfolios. But they also enable speculation at scales that would make Amsterdam's wildest speculators gasp. The 2008 financial crisis was partly caused by derivatives so complex that even the people trading them didn't fully understand the risks. Amsterdam showed that financial innovation could mobilize capital efficiently. Modern markets demonstrate that financial innovation can also create catastrophic systemic risks. Both legacies, positive and negative, trace back to those initial innovations. Now let's talk about urban planning, because this is where the three cities' legacies diverge in interesting ways. Amsterdam's model of comprehensive systematic planning influenced how many cities think about urban development even today. The idea that cities should be planned as integrated systems, with conscious attention to infrastructure, transportation, green space, and aesthetic coherence, comes directly from Amsterdam's Canal Belt. When modern cities create master plans, establish design standards, or zone different areas for different uses, they're following principles that Amsterdam pioneered. The specific forms have changed. We don't build canal systems anymore, at least not usually. But the underlying approach of treating cities as systems that can be rationally organized remains influential. London's model of market-driven development within light regulatory frameworks became dominant in the English-speaking world and spread globally through British colonial influence. The pattern you see in most American and British Commonwealth cities, private developers building according to market demand, with government setting minimum standards but not directing development comprehensively, traces directly to London's post-fire rebuilding and square development. This model has advantages. It's flexible, responsive to demand, and doesn't require massive state capacity to implement. But it also has problems. It can lead to sprawl, inequality, inadequate public amenities, and environmental degradation. Modern debates about urban development, how much should markets determine city form versus how much should government plan, are essentially replaying arguments that implicitly began in the tension between Amsterdam's planned approach and London's market approach. The residential square that London invented evolved into the modern planned residential community, the gated community, the suburb organised around private amenities. When you see a neighbourhood organised around a private park, golf course or pool, with architectural standards and restrictive covenants enforced by a homeowners association, you're looking at direct descendants of London squares. The legal mechanisms, ground leases, restrictive covenants, private governance of common spaces, are the same ones developed for square development in the 1600s and 1700s. London showed that private development could create planned communities. Modern suburbs demonstrate that this model scales to encompass entire cities. New York's grid system, which we didn't fully explore in this narrative but which represents the third major urban innovation, took the logical endpoint of treating urban land as a commodity. The Manhattan grid reduced city planning to its most minimal form: divide land into standardized blocks, let market forces determine what gets built where, assume that private interest will generate public good. This is now the dominant model in American urban development. establish a basic framework, then let developers do what they want within broad parameters. The result, the grid system that made New York possible also made possible strip malls, suburban sprawl, and the car-dependent development patterns that now define much of America. The three models, Amsterdam's comprehensive planning, London's market-driven squares, New York's grid commodification, represent different points on a spectrum of how much public versus private control should shape cities. Every modern city falls somewhere on this spectrum, often mixing elements of all three approaches. Singapore is probably closest to Amsterdam's model, highly planned, systematically organized, with government directing development comprehensively. American cities are mostly closer to New York's model, minimal planning, market-driven development, private initiative within loose frameworks. European, the New York capital, a financial crisis in one can cascade globally within hours. The VOC's model of a quasi-governmental corporation with monopoly powers and military capacity evolved into the British East India Company, which literally governed India for a century, and into modern multinational corporations that operate across borders with resources exceeding those of many nation-states. Should corporations have political power? How should democracies control corporate behavior? These questions were present from the moment the VOC was chartered, and we're still struggling with them. The information infrastructure that supported Amsterdam's stock exchange, newsletters, coffeehouses, informal networks sharing commercial intelligence, evolved through London's coffeehouses and New York's financial press into modern financial media. Bloomberg terminals, CNBC, financial Twitter, various news services all serve the same function that those early newsletters did, distributing information that affects asset prices to people who need it for trading decisions. The advantage modern traders have is speed and volume of information. The fundamental challenge remains the same. How do you sort signal from noise, reliable information from manipulation, genuine insight from self-serving hype? Amsterdam, when developers use leverage to build spec houses or commercial buildings, they're using strategies perfected in 1700s London. When they create restrictive covenants to maintain neighborhood character, they're using legal tools invented for square development. When the environmental costs of the urban and economic models these cities pioneered are now unavoidably apparent in ways they weren't in the 1600s and 1700s. The Dutch model of systematic land reclamation and intensive resource use helped make the Netherlands wealthy, but also created vulnerability to climate change that now threatens the country. The English model of converting agricultural land to cities and pastures contributed to deforestation and ecological degradation that took centuries to reverse, if it was reversed at all. The extractive relationship with nature that enabled these cities' development, treating natural resources as infinite, environmental costs as someone else's problem, is no longer sustainable, if it ever was. Climate change, in particular, exposes vulnerabilities in all three models. Amsterdam's systematic approach to water management, which allowed the city to exist below sea level, now requires constant upgrading to handle rising sea levels and more intense storms. London's growth patterns, which assumed unlimited expansion into surrounding countryside, now face constraints as agricultural land becomes scarce and transportation costs rise. New York's density and coastal location create risks from hurricanes and flooding that are increasing with climate change. The social inequalities that were embedded in these cities' development models, Amsterdam's merchant elite versus workers, London's exclusive squares versus slums, New York's speculative development enriching landowners while creating housing scarcity, persist in modified forms today. Global cities still feature extreme wealth concentration, with financial sectors capturing enormous shares of economic output, while service workers struggle with cost of living. Exclusive neighborhoods still use mechanisms descended from London squares to maintain property values through exclusion. The cities invented capitalism's wealth generation mechanisms, but they also baked in capitalism's inequality-generating mechanisms. The question of whether these patterns are inevitable or could have been different is unanswerable but important. Could Amsterdam have created stock markets without enabling speculation and manipulation? Could London have developed market-driven housing without creating exclusionary neighborhoods? Could any of these cities have grown without environmental degradation or social inequality? Maybe not. Maybe these trade-offs were inherent in the development paths available. Or maybe different choices at crucial moments could have created alternative models. We'll never know, but the question matters because it affects whether we think modern problems are fixable or baked into the system. What's clear is that the models these cities created were adapted and modified as they spread globally. Tokyo's density, Lagos's informality, Singapore's state-led development, Dubai's mega-project approach, all represent variations on or reactions against the basic templates that Amsterdam, London, and New York established. The innovations were powerful enough to shape global development patterns while being flexible enough to adapt to different circumstances, cultures, and political systems. The digital revolution is arguably creating the first fundamentally new economic model since Amsterdam invented modern finance. Cryptocurrency enthusiasts talk about replacing centralized stock exchanges with decentralized blockchain systems. Tech companies are creating network effect monopolies that don't fit neatly into traditional corporate structures. Whether these changes represent evolution within the existing system or genuinely new alternatives remains to be seen. So far, most innovations look suspiciously like reinventing structures that Amsterdam invented 4 centuries ago, just with different technology. The pandemic exposed both the resilience and fragility of the urban systems these cities pioneered. Cities proved adaptable, businesses moved online, people found ways to maintain economic activity despite lockdowns, the essential infrastructure kept functioning. But the pandemic also revealed vulnerabilities, dependence on office concentrations for urban vitality, inequalities in who could work from home versus who had to risk exposure, the costs of density when disease transmission matters. Whether the pandemic represents a temporary disruption or a permanent shift in urban development patterns depends partly on whether we learn the right lessons from these 3 cities' histories. Looking forward, the challenges facing global cities, climate change, inequality, housing affordability, infrastructure decay, social fragmentation, require rethinking some assumptions that these 3 cities established. Maybe London's market-driven flexibility needs tempering with stronger public intervention to address market failures. Maybe New York's commodification of land needs revision to treat housing as a right rather than purely a market good. Or maybe entirely new models are needed that these historical examples can't provide. But even if we need new models, understanding the old ones matters. Their successes explain why we're vastly wealthier than people in 1600, why cities house billions of people, why global trade and finance function at all. Their failures explain persistent inequality, environmental degradation, financial instability, and urban dysfunction. The story Amsterdam, London,